Just want to thank University of California, Irvine, Calplug Research Center for providing lunch. Thank you all again for being here. We're going to jump right into our afternoon session. So the way it's going to work is we're going to have two more presentations, and then we'll have our panel discussion on EVs. And then we have a mid-afternoon break. And then our last session for the day is two presentations plus a panel discussion with also including some of the earlier presenters. And then again, I want to remind you that at the end of the day, 5 o'clock, there is a networking reception that's provided again by UCI and the Calplug Research Center. And thank you very much to you all for being here. Thank you very much to Calplug, Patricia Lim, GP Lee, who is not able to be here today because he is traveling. And thank you to the team at Calplug and CALIT2. Okay, so our next speaker is Catherine Dayam, and she's going to be speaking on electric vehicles as a grid resource and plug loads, benefits and opportunities. I will introduce Catherine and then turn it over to her. Dr. Catherine Dayam is the principal of Exergy Consulting. She helps U.S. and global clients analyze and cultivate emerging clean energy resources at the grid's edge. Her research is focused on identifying impactful ways to reduce energy use, cost, and emissions, and has contributed to deep savings through new technology adoption and energy efficiency regulations. Her recent work has delved into beneficial electrification strategies such as electric vehicle load control and electrified space heating. She holds a BS in Environmental Engineering Science from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in Geophysics from the University of Colorado at Boulder.
Just use the arrows. Okay. Like a slideshow. How do I do slideshow? I don't often do slideshows. Good enough? That's good enough. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kim, and thanks to everyone at Calplug for hosting this workshop and for asking me here to speak about EVs. First, a little bit about Exergy Consulting for those of you who don't know us. We do energy efficiency and beneficial electrification in buildings and transportation. We provide technical and market research and strategy development for policies and utility program design, and we also evaluate new technologies for energy and emissions savings benefits. Some of the things we've been working on lately, we are working for the California IOUs to develop proposals for the California Energy Commission's low power modes roadmap. And then we're also investigating electrified technologies for water heating, space heating, especially in cold climates, and vehicles. A lot of our work on EVs has been with the NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. They're a trade group that represents the electric cooperatives in the US, so I just want to acknowledge their work in EVs and electrification in general. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few fun facts about EVs to set the foundation for this talk. So the first thing is that EVs are here, their market share is increasing rapidly. RMI published a report earlier this year projecting that EVs will comprise about 60 to 85% of the global market by 2030. And the US is not far behind that mark. thanks in part to some national and state mandates and targets. EVs are already cheaper to operate and maintain than ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles. But one key barrier remains is the high price of EVs. RMI is also projecting that the EVs will reach sticker price parity with ICE cars in the US pretty soon, within the next 5 years or so. So that'll help adoption rates increase as well. Second fact is that EVs have lower life cycle impact than ICE vehicles. This was a nice analysis by the Union of Concerned Scientists, where they compared the lifetime emissions intensity of electric cars versus gasoline-powered ones. They found that for both types of vehicles, the majority of the impact was in the operations phase, so in the driving, and that EVs do have a larger impact in the manufacturing compared to ICE vehicles, and that's a lot to do with the battery manufacturing. But since EVs save in the driving phase, after about 20,000 miles of driving, their impacts are about the same, and beyond that, EVs are a benefit. Okay, and third is that EV impact is decreasing as the grid integrates more renewable generation and the emissions intensity of electricity decreases, so too does EVs. So on that previous graph, that gray bar is shrinking, or if you like, you can look at it in miles per gallon equivalent. On a 95% renewable grid, driving an EV is comparable to driving a ICE vehicle that gets about 450 miles per gallon. Okay, so that kind of brings me to my unscientifically stated thesis here, which is EVs are pretty great, and they're getting better with time. And also, as I'll talk about in the following slides, they do need to improve so we can get the most out of them that we can. So, following the themes of this workshop, we'll look at EVs as grid resources, that is, ways that we can help integrate renewable generation into the grid, both because they are flexible loads and they're also batteries, so they're storage. And then we'll look at EVs as plug loads. Now, Kim mentioned that maybe they're plug loads and maybe not, but just for the purposes of this discussion, we're gonna look at them as plug loads and look at their current efficiencies and then think about how that might be improved. Okay, so first, EVs are flexible loads. That means they can shift their operation or their time when they use electricity to different times of day. That might be beneficial. So in particular, that's when we have renewable generation available. EVs are a little tricky compared to the other flexible loads here, mostly because they're mobile. Whereas like a water heater is always plugged in and available for charging up if we have excess generation, the EV might be out and about driving and not plugged in somewhere. The good thing is that EVs spend most of their time not driving. The average EV passenger vehicle in the US drives about 40 miles a day. So the key here is that we need to figure out whether the EVs are and make sure they're connected so that we can benefit from them. Okay, there are several ways to manage EVs to improve renewable generation integration. Those include matching the EV charging load to the renewable generation supply. So when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, we should be charging. We can also curtail EV charging loads during demand peaks. And then we can do things on a more real-time basis, like frequency regulation, where if the grid frequency is too high, we could charge EV batteries to suck some of that up. Or we could do some real-time orchestration with EV chargers to get around some infrastructure constraints that we're starting to have. One example here is distribution transformers that are in neighborhoods. We're never really sized for all-electric homes with EVs. And so there's real concern that when people get home and all plug in their charge, that we're going to be overloading those distribution transformers. So what if we can orchestrate everyone's charging so that everyone gets their charge when they need it, but we're not exceeding the capacity of that transformer? So the way utilities are going to be shifting load depends on the generation they have on their system. And so just a couple examples. The California grid, of course, on the top has a lot of solar generation in orange during the day and an evening peak. So we want to move charging load probably to the middle of the day right now. Whereas the mid-continent grid has a lot of wind. They've been working on charging load overnight. But of course, these generation curves are going to change as we add more renewables to the grid. For example, California is adding offshore wind, so we might need to be shifting EV charging to overnight. While MISO is getting a lot of solar on their system, they might have a duck curve in 10 years that they need to mitigate. So what we need to do is characterize EV charging load shape and understand the number of EVs, the per vehicle demand, and the timing of the demand. So there are lots of pilots and programs out there to try to characterize this EV load shape. And then once we understand that load shape, we need to build out the infrastructure where the EVs are and where at the time that renewable generation is available. So that might, for example, point to workplace charging if you have a lot of solar on your system. Now, there's a final challenge in that right now EVs need to be plugged into the grid to be valuable. So we need to build out that infrastructure, but we also need to incentivize EV drivers to actually plug in and make their vehicles available for flexible charging. Wireless charging is something that could help alleviate some of that, and I'm going to talk about that in the plugage section, so stay tuned. Okay, let's look at EVs as storage. EVs have big batteries. They're 50, 75, 100 kilowatt hour batteries. Compare that to home batteries that might be 10, 12 kilowatt hours, and then you kind of stack them up. EVs present a really great resource that could not only power your car when you're driving it, but power other loads. So this general idea has a lot of names: vehicle to grid, V2G, vehicle to building, V2B, maybe more generally vehicle grid integration. And there are a lot of things we can do with this. We can do load shifting, and energy arbitrage is one flavor of that is common here in California, where when electricity rates are cheap during the day with lots of solar, you can charge up batteries, and then during peak times when electricity is high, you can discharge those to a building or a home. They can be used as backup power for powering a building or a home when the grid is out. And again, they can be used for frequency regulation, this time in both directions, charging the batteries when grid frequency is high and discharging when grid frequency drops. To do any of this, we need bidirectional equipment that is both in the electric vehicle and the upper figure. The vehicle needs a battery that can charge and discharge with a control unit that allows it to discharge that energy. And then between the vehicle and the home or the grid, we need a bidirectional inverter and a way to synchronize that now AC power to the grid or the building. There's interest in doing V2G, V2B on all kinds of vehicle types. There are maybe a handful of passenger EVs right now that are capable of V2G or V2B, including the F-150 from Ford. And you can see on the back wall in that garage, that's their bidirectional charger and home integration unit. Vehicles like buses and other medium and heavy-duty vehicles that have large batteries and a lot of time between drive sessions so that those batteries can be discharged and then recharged. And then fleets of vehicles whose batteries can be aggregated into one big storage resource. So that might be rental car fleets or municipal vehicles. So where are we in implementation? Well, I'd say we're still in the early stages. We do have the technology available to do it, but we do have a lot of challenges to overcome. We need that bidirectional equipment, the connection from the vehicle to the building or grid. We need standards for the equipment to be able to communicate, to transmit power safely and keep data secure. Battery degradation is a big issue. Lithium-ion batteries degrade with the number of cycles. And so EV owners and EV manufacturers have to be okay with using the batteries for something other than driving the vehicle. And finally, I think the biggest hurdle is the economics. We need to understand the value of V2G and V2B to EV owners and what kind of incentives we need to put around there, and the utilities too. We also need a way to be able to compare V2G and V2B strategies with other load management strategies. So we have to identify use cases that provide the best value, and that's going to depend on your location, the grid conditions, types of vehicles, what strategy you're doing. So all that is to say, there's a lot of ongoing pilots and research in this area. I'm going to quickly highlight just a couple pilots to give you a flavor of what's going on. Jumpstart Maui was an early V2G proof of concept pilot, really. They had 80 Nissan Leafs and bidirectional chargers installed at their homes. The idea was to discharge the vehicles during their evening peak and recharge during overnight wind generation. On the top figure, you'll see the discharge, and it might not seem all that impressive maxing out at 3 kilowatts, but they were limited by the utility to discharge each vehicle for only 30 minutes at 1 kilowatt, so that might be artificially low, but the point is they were able to do it. They also, in this pilot, did load shifting. So the bottom figure, negative kilowatts is the charge load, the red line is their baseline, and then the blue bars are their managed charging load. And they were able to shift quite a lot of load off their peaks and onto off-peak times. So I think more studies like this where we can compare the value of discharging batteries versus shifting is probably needed to understand the relative values. Another neat pilot is closer to here in the Cajon Valley Union School District. They have a V2G school bus pilot where they're working with 7 electric school buses that can discharge between 24 and 45 kilowatt hours per bus, or kilowatts per bus, sorry. They are able to reliably discharge the buses, and they're now participating in SDG&E's emergency load reduction program, which pays them $2 per kilowatt hour when those emergency events are called. They've had some challenges around equipment reliability, but I think the bigger challenge here is obviously the economics. $2 per kilowatt hour on a program that doesn't actually call events very often is not going to pay back the cost of that bidirectional equipment very quickly. So we need to develop a market for the discharging of batteries if we're going to have any hope of paying off the initial cost of the equipment. And then the last thing I'll say about V2G is there might be use cases where we use the mobility of the vehicle as a benefit. I've talked to several co-ops that are interested in using their electric school buses to power critical buildings during storms or other grid outages. So I think this is actually just a really neat application. Okay, lastly, let's look at EVs as plug loads. They're a system of components that we in the energy efficiency community recognize as plug loads. They have battery charger systems, motors, HVAC systems, and a whole ton of electronics. They also have distinct operating modes, active mode when you're driving it, different charging modes, active charging and maintenance, and then low power modes when it's parked or idling. EVs have a wide range of efficiency. This is a nice chart from ACEEE where they're plotting efficiency on the horizontal axis in miles per kilowatt hour, so bigger is better, against vehicle weight. And you see, yes, efficiency is related to vehicle weight, but even looking at vehicles of the same weight, you see we have a really wide spread of efficiency, indicating that there is opportunity for at least the poorer performers to improve. So let's think about how they can improve. First is improve aerodynamics. EVs don't have an internal combustion engine in the front, so they don't need to be like boxy. They can really benefit from improved aerodynamics and lower drag coefficients. So that Tesla Model Y has a low nose and a nice slippery shape, and it has a low drag coefficient of 0.23. I think in an effort to get EVs to market quickly, a lot of legacy manufacturers have taken basically the shell of an ICE car and retrofitted it with an electric drivetrain. And while that will get a vehicle to market more quickly, you can't benefit from improved aerodynamics. So this Volvo Recharge, for example, has a much higher coefficient of drag, and then you can see its efficiency suffers. It can go a mile less per kilowatt hour compared to the Tesla. Second is reducing vehicle weight. So that might mean smaller battery packs if we're willing to accept that. If we have a good charge network built out, maybe we can deal with smaller batteries and less range on our vehicles. But I think really the opportunity here is improving energy density. So basically, research and development of new batteries. Lithium-ion batteries have improved their energy density through time, as shown in the upper plot. And then new chemistries, particularly solid-state batteries or lithium metal batteries, show promise for higher energy density. Third is efficient battery charging. Right now, our main charging methods they're both wired, level 2 and DC fast charging. Level 2 charging might be like in the 83 to 94% efficient range, and fast charging maybe 90 to 95% efficient. How can this get better? And then wireless charging. So if you're familiar with wireless charging in electronics, you might get a little heartburn from this because like phone chargers, wireless phone chargers aren't all that efficient compared to wired. EV wireless charging is based on magnetic resonance. So it's a different type of technology that allows for pretty efficient power transfer across air gap. And the DOE is putting a lot of research money into making sure this is a focus and we improve here, because wireless charging could be a real benefit to integrating vehicles on the grid. So right now we're about 80 to 90% efficient on wireless. There's a prototype out of Oak Ridge National Lab that's 97%. And if you talk to people who are working on wireless charging, they see the potential for it to be as efficient as wired charging. So I think for the energy efficiency community here, it's measuring, understand the improvements that we can be making in charging efficiently. And then there are things for which I haven't seen any data. I don't know if anyone has data besides maybe the manufacturers on motor efficiency, HVAC, and other components. How efficient are those? And then how well do these vehicles power manage their systems, turn off the components that are not needed, especially when they're parked. So I think there's been a lot of effort into getting EVs to market, and rightly so. But now that we're getting there, I think we really need to focus on their efficiency and help manufacturers incorporate efficiency into their designs early and throughout their design process. And you might be thinking, well, does efficiency even matter anymore if we have a renewable grid and we're decarbonizing everything? And I argue, yes, it still does matter, because it's going to make our energy transition easier and faster. More efficient EVs and devices in general mean we have to build out less renewable generation. It means that we have a pretty geriatric transmission grid that needs a lot of improvements. The less congestion we cause on that, the more maybe we can delay or avoid improvements on that. Smaller battery packs mean that we can constrain mineral resources that go into those batteries further, more batteries, more cars. And lighter vehicles mean less tire and road wear, so we're producing less of that stuff, and less of that stuff gets into our waterways and ecosystems. So just thinking big picture there. But in closing, back to the statement of EVs are pretty great. They're getting better and they need to improve. EVs do benefit the grid. They cost less to operate and maintain now, and they're reaching cost parity in the next few years, and they reduce emissions. They are this flexible load that allows us to better integrate renewable generation. And we still have work to do to figure out the best values of EV load management and V2G, and then improve EV efficiency to reduce our impact. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We have barely time for one question.
Thank you for the presentation, Catherine. Very informative, certainly for those of us a little bit outside this sector. One of your slides, you talked about the challenges, and one of those challenges was economics. And I'm just wondering, and I think you acknowledged some research going on in that area. Is any of that research focused on consumers and what their expectations or opinions are about, say, they paid to charge their EV, now they're being asked to give up that investment to the grid, maybe be compensated, maybe not, at least be inconvenienced. Have you done any consumer sentiment research along those lines?
I don't know if there is any that's been done yet. I agree that that's a key hurdle, and we need to understand how consumers feel about basically shortening the life of their batteries by powering other things. You can test that with incentives and see if people latch onto it. Or you can survey them, and I suspect that you maybe get an answer quicker if you survey them. So that's a great idea.
Thank you. Oh, Alan, do you? Yeah, thanks. We do have to move on, and our panel is after this next presentation, so you can ask Catherine all your questions at the time. Okay. Our next presentation is by Dr. Zhao-Kai Liu, called Transportation Network Modeling and Infrastructure Planning. Zhao-Kai Liu is a researcher with the Computational Science Center at NREL. He's currently working on the ground transportation infrastructure planning and shuttle bus system analysis for the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, an Athena project funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, Vehicle Technologies Office. He will also work on a DOE project titled Increasing Affordability, Energy Efficiency, and Ridership of Transit Bus Systems through Large-Scale Electrification. Dr. Liu is developing a high-performance computing-enabled scalable algorithm for the strategic planning of electric bus systems. In collaboration with other researchers at NREL, he will help develop a tool for electric bus energy consumption estimation and optimization. Welcome, Zhao-Kai, to the front. So you?
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zhao-Kai Liu in the AI, Learning, and Intelligent Systems Group from National Renewable Energy Lab. I'm delighted to attend today's workshop. In this presentation, I would like to share with you our studies on data-driven electric vehicle charging demand modeling and charging infrastructure planning. First, I would like to briefly talk about the background and motivation of our studies. Over the past few years, we have seen exponential growth in global PV sales. EV sales exceeded 10 million in 2022. It's more than tripled in 3 years, from 4% in 2020 to 14% in 2022. It's predicted that EV sales will reach 14 million by the end of 2023, representing about 18% of total car sales. However, charging is still a major concern for potential EV buyers. A recent survey shows that 6 in 10 Americans who aren't yet sold on PVs were concerned about where and when they would charge and how far that charge will take them. Early charging patterns are home dominant, but many future PV owners may not have access to home chargers. EV charging is a priority for the federal government. The government has set ambitious goals to reach 50% EV sales by 2030. They also plan to deploy 500,000 PV chargers by then. The 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law includes $7.5 billion to build out a national network of EV chargers. The 2022 Inflation Reduction Act also provides federal tax credits for EV infrastructure, EV purchases, and domestic mining and manufacturing. The major uncertainty here is that EV charging infrastructure requirements are hard to predict over time, and they are challenging to plan for. And it motivates us to develop a data-driven modeling framework to analyze the charging demand and the infrastructure planning needs. In this presentation, I will talk about our modeling frameworks for passenger EVs and electric transit buses. So for passenger EVs, the data we used includes national household travel survey data, real-world connected vehicle trip data, land use data, and vehicle registration and the EV adoption prediction data. For electric buses, we use the general transit feeder specification data, electric bus deployment prediction data, and energy consumption prediction data. Let's first look at passenger electric vehicles. So for our modeling framework, it mainly includes 5 steps. The first step is trip data acquisition and pre-processing. So we purchase the representative light-duty vehicle travel data for the regions of study. The data is then joined with the geographically determined locational characteristics obtained from multiple data sources, like the population, land use data. The second step is the EV adoption modeling. So for a target year or given analysis year, we assign plug-in electric vehicles to households by vehicle models with different battery size, energy consumption rate, the charging power rate for the simulation. The third step is the travel itinerary synthesis. So for the vehicle trips data we purchased, they don't have persistent vehicle identifiers due to the privacy issue. So in order to simulate the charging demand, we developed a trip chaining method to generate synthetic travel itineraries for EV users. The next step is EV charging simulation. EV charging is simulated for synthetic travel itineraries, considering the EV adoption assumptions, charging behaviors, locations of EVSE availability, home charging access assumptions. And in the last step, we generate EV load profiles. The charging demand for a given analysis year is assigned to specific locations by the location type. So for the real-world driving data, we purchased connected vehicle trip data from a company called Weiju. The data represents about 3% of the passenger vehicle population. We consider the 2 months, September 2021 and February 2022. These 2 months are purposely chosen to avoid the impact of the COVID-19 Omicron surge. Our study region is Richmond and Newport News in Virginia. So with this trip connected vehicle data, we join them with land use data to inform or to infer the trip purpose of each trip OD. We use the Unreal model called Tempo to predict the EV adoption. So this Tempo model is an all-inclusive transport demand model. It projects household-level vehicle ownership and the technology choices based on heterogeneous consumer preferences. So for our study, we consider aggressive 2040 scenario. It assumes that 50% national PEV sales by 2030 and 100% PEV sales by 2035. So after we get the EV prediction results, the EV adoption is further mapped to a vehicle archetype table shown in the bottom right. So in total, we considered 11 different types of electric vehicles that have different driving range, different energy consumption rate, and also different charging power. And next, we generate synthetic travel itineraries. As I mentioned before, the real-world connected vehicle data usually do not have persistent vehicle identifiers due to the privacy issue. So we developed a trip chaining method to generate synthetic travel itineraries. We use the locational dwell distributions from the National Household Survey data to infer vehicle dwells at each stop. And then we chain the trips based on spatial temporal alignment of trip origins and destinations. Some key distributions from the generated synthetic itineraries is compared with the distributions from the National Household Travel Survey data. The validation plots on the bottom right demonstrate that the generated travel itineraries will match the National Household Travel Survey data. So it means the generated itineraries can capture some of the key features or key characteristics of people's driving behavior. We use another NRO model called EVI Pro to simulate EV charging behaviors. EVI Pro takes EV adoption and travel demand data and simulate EV charging behaviors, energy demands, and the infrastructure requirements. So for this study, EV drivers are assumed to prioritize home charging, followed by workplace and public solar charging. This assumption is supported by real-world charging data. So for the home charging access, we used a previous modeling effort to estimate the home charging accessibility. So for our study region and the 2040 scenario, about 72% of the EV owners will have home charging accessibility. And the EVI Pro model, using the EVI Pro model, we can generate the charging demand for a whole week. And last, we can generate the EV load profiles. So for our study, we consider both intra-region and inter-region travels. For the inter-region charging demand is directly obtained from the EVI Pro simulations. For inter-region charging demand, we have a separate simulation effort for those long-distance trips that end within the region of study. EV charging events can then assign special coordinates depending on their location type. For home charging locations, we consider EV adoption projections and residential land use data. For workplace and public charging events, we use the census tract of charging demand and the commercial land use data. The EV charging events can further be assigned to individual stations depending on the EVSE types, the station size, and the port utilization assumptions. So the figure on the bottom right shows a zoomed in results of the EV charging demand. So all those small parcels is one household or one apartment. So the area with the lighter color is just a small single-family house. The one with the darker color is a apartment. This slide shows the complete modeling framework. So in summary, we have three key components or three key models. The tempo model takes the analysis year, the vehicle type, and owner type to predict the future electric vehicle adoption. The EVI depth or the trip chaining model takes the raw real-world trip events data, the land use data, and the national household travel survey data to generate synthetic travel itineraries. And then we have the EVI Pro model to simulate the charging demand of electric vehicles and produce a charging demand database. So using this database, we can then determine the locations of charging stations. We can also use this database to do some grid side analysis. Next, I would like to briefly talk about the modeling framework for electric buses. This modeling framework is based on the so-called GTFS data. So for transit system, they usually have relatively fixed routes and timetables, and also its depot and terminal locations are known. So this diagram shows the modeling framework. So on the top side, we have the energy consumption prediction module. So basically, we take the route shapes of each bus service route and map them to the underlying road segment. We know that each route consists of a series of road segments. For each road segment, we will know the average speed and the road grade. And then we have a trained so-called route E model, a mesoscopic machine learning model to predict the energy consumption for each road segment. And then we aggregate them together, we will have a trip level energy consumption for the bus service. On the bottom, we have the simulation. So we have the trip sequence, the stop times from the GTFS data. We can construct a bus daily trip itineraries. And then we made some assumptions about the charging strategy. We can then run the simulation for the charging. Similarly, we will have a charging demand database. We can use it to either determine the charging infrastructure planning or help the grid side analysis. So I will briefly talk about the data we used for the analysis. So the GDFS data is the General Transit Feeder Specification or the Google Transit Feeder Specification. So this data defines a common format for public transportation schedules and the associated geographic information. We use this data because it's publicly available. This data includes a series of standardized TXT files. It can be easily shared, read, and used by anyone. The data contains all information relating to the fixed schedules. We can extract geospatial and scheduling information from the data. So for the depot locations, we extract that from the National Transit Database. For those missing information, especially the deadhead trips, we just use the shortest path algorithm to generate those deadhead trips. So for our study, we consider 3 transit agencies in the study area, the WATA, the GRTC, and the HRT. So the figure on the right shows the locations for those 3 transit systems. The table summarizes some key parameters for these 3 transit systems. So they have a different fleet size, different number of routes. The weekday service blocks and the weekend service blocks are different. So basically, during weekdays, we usually have a higher frequency and more services. So for the simulation, we made some assumptions. So we only consider 2 types of electric buses. There are 2 models from the Proterra. They have different battery size and consumption rate. The simulation is pretty simple. We assume that the buses will try to minimize the upfront and operation costs. So basically, they will prefer depot charging than terminal charging. They prefer smaller batteries and a smaller or lower charging rate. After running the simulation, we can get some results for the energy needs for each system during weekday, weekends at different locations. We also can consider the winter and the summer difference. So basically, during winter time, we have higher charging demand due to the impact from the temperature. We are also able to generate location-specific load profiles. I need to highlight that this load profile is just for uncontrolled charging. We can see if we can run some optimization algorithms here, we can easily lower the peak of the charging power demand because a lot of the dwell time at the depot are not fully utilized. We are also able to generate those Calplug plots for like showing the spatial distribution of those charging demands. So basically, those charging demand results can help transit agencies understand the charging demand and inform the decisions of charging station deployment. Currently, we are working on developing a user-friendly tool for transit agencies. So our goal is that, so from this dashboard, transit agencies will be able to like click the drop-down menu to pick their specific transit systems. They can further pick a specific service block, and this dashboard will basically tell them the needed battery size, the needed charging power, and the state of charge profile. So basically, this tool will help them determine like the planning and the operation of the electric bus system in the future. So next steps for private vehicles, we plan to have a higher resolution and high fidelity results. I see the key challenges here is really the data availability and the privacy issue. So I mean, in the private vehicle modeling, we need to generate those synthetic travel itineraries because we are not able to get the real-world travel itineraries due to the privacy issue. We are also working on more medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, there are many more vehicle types and heterogeneous vocational usage patterns, but we have limited data to kind of capture the full extent of the operations. Also, for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, it's more challenging to predict their adoption and the timing. And the charging technology is less mature than passenger vehicles. with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much. Bringing this back to plug and process loads for a moment, which I understand isn't your specialty, but one of the models that NREL has is something called ResStock, which enables us to perhaps superimpose your electricity needs per household on top of typical residential profiles. And that then allows utilities to see what the load impact is in their region. Have you done that, or are you considering doing that?
Thank you for the questions. Actually, during the lunch break, I was having a meeting with NREL folks. We are discussing the ResStock database. So currently, they are funded by DOE to kind of update the data set to incorporate the additional charging demand from electric vehicles. So they are working on that. In a separate project, we are trying to leverage the ResStock as the base load, and then incorporate the EV charging load to see two things. First, like on the normal operation, what will be the impact from the electric vehicles? Second, if there's a power outage, could the electric vehicles be used as an energy source for those key home devices? So it can provide benefits on the resilience side. So we are working on that. We have two separate projects on that.
Other questions? I have a question. You talked a great deal about the process for analysis, which I thought was really good, but what were some of the results and findings? Some of the interesting excerpts. You analyzed the bus EV transportation in the Norfolk area. What were some of the potential recommendations to the area or policy recommendations that you have as a result of your analysis?
Yeah, that's a good comment. So I mean, originally I have a few slides that are showing the charging pattern. Like for the home charging, the peak is during the nighttime, right after people come back from work, and then for the workplace charging is when people arrive at the work location. For the public charging, it's like it has a flattened pattern. So basically, it does not have a obvious peak. So I delete that one because one is the time limit. Maybe I should keep that one as an important one. But the real impact will be further analyzed by the grid team. So that's why I take it off. So I would like highlight one thing. So we published a report 2 months ago. It's called 30 by 50 or 50 by 30. So it's a national level analysis report. So basically, it tells you by 2030 what's the needed EVSEs at a national level. So basically, it provides the recommendations about, like, for each state, what will be the needed number of charging ports for public locations, for work locations. So if you're interested, I might. You can contact me. I can share a link with you. I believe it's publicly available. It's published a few months ago. It's a national analysis report.
Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to have our panel discussion on EVs. So I would love for Chelsea, Kiwei, Catherine, and Zhao Kai to come up to the front. I also need Chris to help me with the Zoom. And we're going to start out our panel discussion. And since, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and start with some panel questions, even though we're still trying to log QA in. So during this time, we invite you to ask questions for the panel or for one individual on the panel. Now, if you don't see somebody on this panel, that means that they're going to be on the panel later on. Okay, so I'm going to get us started with some general questions. Okay, so since this is focusing on EVs, but Chelsea, you're here for smart IAC, so you can respond to this question based on smart IAC. So my question is, what are the next steps for electric vehicle research or Industrial Assessment Center research? So we'll start with Industrial Assessment Center. We'll go through the group left to right. So go ahead, Chelsea.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on EVs, what we've been seeing with our assessments, we've actually seen this come up in both industrial and commercial buildings where they either want a solar parking structure for their employees to charge during work. So those are things that we are actually looking at. Though currently, one of the big things we're focusing on is our hydrogen project. So just for industrial research, we're looking towards hydrogen as one option, though we know there's many, many different pieces of that pie that kind of go together.
Catherine?
So I guess just going back to EV efficiency and the nice facilities for testing EVs here Dominic talked about earlier. I think we should get some EVs there and start figuring out how efficient they are and where they can be improved.
I think there's a few things. So first, maybe we need to consider like the questions asked by the audience, the connection between the home devices and the electric vehicles. So we might need to kind of update the data set we have. We need to consider all the devices. Also, another point, another device I forgot to mention is the PV and the energy storage. So basically, we might need to have a model that can, based on the household information, like the parking, whether you have a parking garage, your income, how many people in the household. We need to have a model that can predict whether the house will adopt EVs, whether the house will install PVs and energy storage. I mean, only with those database and information, we can then kind of analyze the potential impact and then make recommendations. Another thing is like the techno-economic analysis. So basically, no matter what kind of policy you make, you need to make sure that will impact the behavior of the consumers. Like if you have a tax incentive for EV adoption or PV adoption, you need to make sure you understand how that will impact consumers' behaviors.
Great, thank you. I don't think our QA is on. Okay, great. Okay, so I have another question, and I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. What technologies are emerging in your respective areas? So what technologies are emerging regarding EVs that might be worth investing in?
I can go ahead and start just with the general industrial landscape. One big thing that we're seeing improved a lot lately is heat pump technology. I know someone mentioned that earlier, but that's something we try to identify good opportunities since that technology has really advanced in the past couple of years. Nowadays, we can use them even in colder climates, which is great. So we try to look for opportunities for heat pumps, and then as well as just general electrification. If there's opportunities, we can reduce the use of natural gas or eliminate it completely. That's something we're trying to move towards here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think wireless charging, wireless power transfer, I touched on it in my talk, but I think, I used to think like, oh, that would be a disaster because it would be inefficient, but it seems like the technology is there to do wireless power transfer to EVs pretty efficiently. And if that's true, then that really changes how we can power different kinds of vehicles. It might still make sense to plug your car in when you're at home, because that's a pretty cheap way to power it. But if we actually can use wireless charging in places like bus stops and taxi stands, that might mean we can have smaller batteries in those types of vehicles. And so I think that would really change the game, but we have to make sure that it's efficient if we're doing it. And then, there's a lot of buzz around electrified roadways. So you could charge while you're driving, which, that would be, again, you can reduce the size of the batteries, and that would really change things. But I think that's further in the future. We first have to get the stationary charging to be efficient.
Thank you.
I would say the smart charging management or vehicle grid integration devices or algorithms. So some of the benefits we mentioned won't be realized if you don't have the smart charging management. For example, the resilience resilience benefit, like if the vehicle does not have the smart charging management or V2 home capability, there's no way you can use the vehicle as a battery storage. Yeah, that's my quick comment.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Please ask questions.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. I never really thought about wireless car charging until today, so thank you for sharing that with me. How do you think technology like that would change like an everyday driver's behavior?
I think it would take a lot of responsibility out of the driver to, plan and then actually take action, that is plug in their vehicle somewhere, in order to have that vehicle as a resource to either charge or discharge when it's beneficial. And so I think it just makes things easier for the driver, and we're all about making things easier so people don't actually have to think about charging the car. It just is. It's almost getting to the gas station type of experience where once in a while you go put gas in your car and you don't think about it anymore. Well, maybe wireless charging can get us closer to that. Like, oh, I don't really have to think very much about fueling my vehicle. Yeah.
Cool, great, thank you.
Thank you again for the earlier presentations, and just kind of following up on a couple of themes here. I'm not sure if this is one or two questions, but thinking about EV as storage, and we were talking a little bit about efficiencies. There was a little bit of discussion about the economic efficiencies, and I'm also curious about the power efficiency, especially when we were just talking about wireless charging. So so maybe I'll just break it up into 2 points. If we talk about the power efficiency, especially if we go wireless and trying to get the storage of the vehicle back into the, seems like it'll be a lot trickier if it's a wireless. So can we talk about that efficiency? And then the other part about the efficiency, the economic efficiency, people's batteries will be lasting a shorter amount of time. So it seems like they should almost, I'll just say roughly double, what it costs to put energy in. They should, if they're using it, providing it back out at night, they should be getting at least double or something like that. So that seems like a pretty big disparity on that. So if any of the panelists have any thoughts on the efficiencies, but or Catherine too. Thanks.
I can go first, and then I'll hand it over to you. So I don't know a lot about wireless charging, I have to say, but I have seen someone from a company that's kind of a startup company making wireless EV charging saying that they can do the discharge efficiently. I don't know technically how that's done and why their technology is special to do that. But it seems like the people working on it do think there's the potential to discharge efficiently. So that's one thing. On the economics, though, of it, I think that is, yeah, a real nut we have to crack. Now there is, there's different flavors of, or I should say, it depends on how you discharge, how much you're going to degrade a battery. If you're keeping the state of charge of the battery between about 20 and 80%, it'll degrade a lot less quickly than if you're discharging further or charging it up a lot. So we need to be smart about how we charge and discharge so that we're not causing extra degradation. And then, yeah, I think it's like Doug was asking, it's understanding what users, what value they place on the battery and the degradation, how much they need to be compensated for that. And yeah, also, I mean, I think it's just, we don't know very much about what it actually costs to discharge the battery, how it's going to reduce the lifetime of the battery, and then, what price we should put on that discharged energy, and if it's going to be economic to pay that price for that energy when we can do something else, like just shift load around.
So I graduated from Utah State University. So when I was doing my PhD, I actually do a few tours. We have a wireless charging track in our university. So basically, they build a test track. They have a electric bus. They can run that, and they have a computer that can show the vehicle is actually wireless, doing wireless charging. So during my PhD, I also did some modeling and analysis work on like whether and where should we deploy the wireless charging lanes. So the thing I noticed is that, so at this moment, currently we don't have much electric wireless charging lanes in the real world, but we do have wireless charging pads. So the real cost or the major cost for the wireless charging lanes is really you need to kind of dig a hole on the road and then bury the charging pads underneath the road segment, and basically you need to rebuild the road actually. So the Utah State Research Center, they applied funding $15 million from NSF. So basically they argue that the American is ready to renew their road system. So why not we take this as an opportunity to deploy the wireless charging lanes? So they are doing some research work on that. So basically the cost is really the road. If we need to renew the road, rebuild the road, we can take the opportunity to install the charging pads. If we need to install the charging pads on a new road, the cost will be huge. So the real world projects I've seen is really for electric buses. So for electric buses, they install the wireless charging pads at bus terminals and bus stops. So basically you only need to install a small pad there. The buses will take advantage of the dwell time at that location to do the wireless charging. The dwell time is long, it's more efficient. Also, the drivers don't need to worry about like plug in or plug out. So that's, I'm not sure whether that will be economically efficient, but it's more convenient for the drivers. Another thing is that for trucks, for those trucks, the charging power will be huge. So the benefit of wireless charging is really the safety. The drivers don't need to like plug in, plug out the high power chargers. So for wireless charging, it can protect the drivers.
Other questions? Katie in the front.
So touching a little bit on user adoption, one of the big things to my mind about that makes it difficult for people to invest in an EV is that people, particularly in Southern California, live in multifamily buildings, and the infrastructure has not been built out to accommodate people who don't have their own personal port in their garage. So what kinds of policy measures or technology solutions do you think would help to solve that problem?
Yeah, that's really a good point. So I mean, so currently, we consider electric vehicles a luxury car, actually, like a Tesla, especially. The upfront cost is very expensive. Also, those early adopters, they usually have a single-family house. They have a dedicated garage. They can install chargers. So that brings up another issue. We call it equity. So when we, for the bipartisan infrastructure law, when we use the money, we might need to consider this equity issue. So we need to specifically consider the home charging accessibility. So we already provide incentives to EV purchase and the home charger installation. So we need to be carefully spend the money so that the low-income people will also benefit from it. So basically, we might need to consider install more public charging stations, like the gasoline stations, right? So people, if they don't have a home charging, they can still finish their daily travel needs. So yeah, that's, by providing incentives, I don't think because you don't have a parking garage, there's no place for you to install charging stations. So the only thing I can see is really provide incentives for vehicle purchase and also provide public charging stations using government funding.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I'm totally blanking on where this is happening, but there are building codes that require a certain number of EV chargers per parking space. I think this is in Washington State, but I could be wrong. So you can do this in, it's challenging if you have residential units that don't have any parking associated with them, but if you do have a garage or a parking lot or something, you can use building codes to require a certain number of chargers per, units. It might be like one charger per 10 units, 10 parking spaces. So there are some ways that people are already using building codes to address this problem. And then, yeah, I think when there is no dedicated space for the residential units, you are kind of limited to public charging.
Thank you.
And QA is here online, but I think she can only hear me. And so if there's questions for her, go ahead and ask them, and I'll repeat the question into the computer. I don't see any questions. Doug has a question. Yes, there's a question.
I have a question for Kiwei. Her presentation, and thank you, it was very technical, but I was wondering, and it sounds like there's a solution, a technical solution to the issues that are created with renewables on the grid and certain end uses like EVs. But can you say anything about the economics around that technical solution or solutions that you described? Are they costly? Is it futuristic? Are they being implemented right now, or anything about that?
Did you hear that, QA?
Can you?
Yeah.
I heard something, but not very clear. Could you repeat?
Yeah. So I repeat the question because she can only hear me through this computer. So let me make sure that the question was, what are the economic implications of the technology that you presented about? It looks like that technology is able to solve some of the voltage drops and the fluctuation as a result of renewables on the grid, but what are the economics of the technology?
Okay. So, thank you. Very good question. So, you know, there are some traditional methods. Let's have a comparison. You will see the economics. So, uh, one of the things I learned before we got this result, um, uh, people think we need real power station, each charge station, and with high volume, the price is very can be very low because it's a semiconductor basically. More install you have, and the lower price
Great.
that gets. So
Great. Uh-huh.
one solution I wanted to say is that in the charger station, a lot of them they actually they use energy storage to provide to absorb this the transient, the turn on, turn off transient, those sharp transients. So they actually charge up a couple of capacitors. So when you need a quickly charge, they inject a bunch from other capacitor to your car, so that doesn't impact the power grid that much. So from that comparison, the OCC DVC, because it doesn't use battery.
Great.
So
Thanks,
the
QA.
price
I think we have
can
to,
be much lower.
yes, I think we have to, thank you. We have to move on to the next question. Doug, did you have a, okay. Alan,
You're relaying the question, right?
I am.
Yeah, okay. So is your proposed solution benefiting the customer or the utility?
Gotcha.
And so what is the greatest value, I guess?
Yep. QA, your question is real quick. Is your solution benefiting the customer or the utility?
Both. So what I say both is that from customer point of view, you have a stabilized voltage, and then your equipment is safe. From a utility point of view, and you avoid bunch of accidents. For example, if you have too much of those voltage spikes, and you may have to trickle off, so that is not good for the utility. So I would say the benefit of both sides. Then in your case, then depends on where you install, maybe benefit customer more in this case, but benefit utility more in the other cases.
QA, thank you very much. So I have a question for Catherine, and this might be a question that not only you answer, but other people on the panel answer, and then potentially people in the audience answer. So Catherine talked a lot about using EVs as a potential for providing grid services in different ways, demand response, shedding, and shifting the load. My question is about the connection between the EV owner who is intending to do this, the building owner who's intending to do this, and the utility. And this might be a series of questions. Currently, what grid signals are out there that can communicate directly with the EV to tell it to charge or discharge at a certain time?
So I think the most basic one is your typical, your classic demand response. It's not communicating directly with the vehicle, though. It communicates with the EVSE. I think utilities are hesitant to be communicating directly with the EV. There's a lot of data and just security concerns around that. So I think it actually would be a lot more efficient if we could just have utilities talk to EVs and say, oh, hey, we need to charge EVs, and if you can get to a charging station, here's your incentive, or something like that. But we don't have that way of communicating yet. It's kind of the typical time of of use rates to indicate to consumers when they should be using electricity, and demand response programs. Yeah.
And what are some examples of the utilities that release these signals?
Oh, which utilities?
Yeah, which utilities?
I'd say any utility could be doing it. Even the small electric cooperatives I work with do a lot of demand response. They tend to do more demand response than time of use rates. But any utility that has a peak and pays high peak demand charges is probably interested in doing demand response.
That's great. Cal, do you have anything to add?
So maybe 2 points. And I would say, based on my research experience, I think there are 2 ways to control the EV charging. One is direct control, indirect control. The time of use might be indirect control. So basically, you have different electricity prices for different time period. The EV users that will kind of it's like a follower for the game, so they might or might not respond to the time of use rate. Another method will be the direct control. So basically, utility companies will have this kind of programs. So EV drivers, they can sign up. So basically, after they sign up these programs, the utility companies might have direct control over the EV charging sessions. So basically, consumers will only tell, basically, they can directly control your charging. So they will, I think you need to provide your SOC needs. So basically, they know when you come back to house, and you specify what do you need for your energy level or state of charge by the in the next morning. They will control the charging. So for the privacy issue, I see a project. So they use this so-called federated learning to do the control. So basically, you don't need to directly access the user's data. So basically, you have an algorithm distributed at a customer level, but the raw data will never be shared with the utility. So they will only kind of be accessed by the local algorithm. So it's so-called the federated learning.
Great. And are these technologies reality or theoretical? Are they implemented by the utilities?
No, I don't think that's the federated learning hasn't been implemented by utility, but it has already been implemented by some big tech companies. They use this to kind of collect your data and store it on your local device. So basically, this originally is used by Google to kind of learn your typing behavior, like so they can provide some suggestions. But I do see a research project at Emerald doing this federated learning to help utility companies do this distributed control. I'm not sure, maybe in the future there will be some pilot projects, but I see great potential in this direction.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi. So I do have a quick question for Zhao Cai. So this is really like specific technical questions. So I'm just wondering, like, when you're doing the modeling for the transportation, so which kind of perspective are you most focused on? For example, the economic output or the energy expenditure. So also, like, what's the logic when you design the modeling for the data perspective, especially from the data perspective? Yeah.
So for our research works, we consider both publicly available data and some data we can purchase. For example, we use the National Household Survey data, so it's publicly available. It can be applied at national level, but when we focus on a specific region, we might want to also consider the region-specific characteristics. For example, if you only use the National Household Travel Survey data, it's like more like a national average. It does not include any region-specific information like the real-world trip, the GPS origin destination information. So that's why we try to find some real world data. We purchased the data from a company called Visual. It's currently under bankruptcy, unfortunately. So hopefully in the future we'll have other data providers. So when we do this kind of analysis, what we try to do is to make sure the results are high fidelity and has a high resolution. We want to, also depending on the customer or the agent for our analysis. For example, we work both with DOE or industry partners. We work with utility companies. So when we work with utility companies, we actually have more data. So the utility company, they can directly provide detailed information of customers. But we are not allowed to share the data, but we can use the data to do the analysis. For example, for a project, we work with a utility company called Excel. They can share the data with us internally. We use the data to kind of analyze the charging demand for electric vehicles. We can then help them determine whether the power grid is good enough or they need to do some upgrade. So it really depends. When we work on DOE projects, if we don't have a partner, we might not have access to this data. We rely more on the publicly available data or some data we can purchase. So it's more challenging when we don't have data. So basically, for the model design, it really depends on what kind of data we can find. So if we have a detailed household level data, we can run very high fidelity simulation. But when we have those low resolution data, we need to kind of make a bunch of assumptions. Like we might need to randomly assign those travel itineraries to households instead of have the real data. So it's like a data-driven approach.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions, Katie? And if we end our questions, we could take an early break. Anyway, go ahead, Katie.
Just to sort of follow up on Kim's question about the load shifting potential for EVs with the grid integration to the building, what are your thoughts about how vehicle to grid integration will interact with larger building energy management systems, or like the grid efficient building concept? What do you think are sort of the main challenges there, or like the greatest opportunities for further research? And Chelsea, you can go ahead and jump in there too for the industrial side.
I think there's great opportunity in buildings that have generation locally to basically use all of that. And if they're not using it in the building, they can use it in the vehicles as long as they have the infrastructure to take advantage of that. So I think that's one easy one. Otherwise, it depends on, if you have people who are willing to discharge their batteries, but if they are, you could potentially have, aggregate a bunch of cars together, and you have a new resource for that building. And you would need to have the infrastructure and the communication to move that power around into the building. At lunch we were talking about DC distribution. I still think it would be great if we could use the solar generation and the power coming off the EV batteries and the stationary batteries, and just use it as DC instead of inverting it and then rectifying it. We could get a lot more efficient distribution of what generation is there, what resources are there on site to power the building. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
I'll say we've seen, a wide variety of different building and where they are with their building energy management systems. So we've seen some pretty good good building energy management systems that could eventually in the future kind of integrate this. We have seen some that probably need a little work. So I think it'll be kind of a evolving field. First, they can hopefully get their building energy management system a little bit more up to date, and then kind of go from there.
Thank you. Other questions? Alan?
Catherine, you had a figure that impressed me. You were comparing the Tesla to the Volvo and the extraordinary difference in efficiency of the vehicles. And I guess I was reflecting on the fact that I was assured that two facts. First of all, that I was assured that the manufacturers would strain to extract the maximum amount of efficiency out of their vehicles and convert it into the consumer's greatest anxiety, which is range. Yet somehow we have this extraordinary fact that here's a car that has lousy range. And by the way, if you read the New York Times yesterday, there was an article about one of those cars, the Volvo, that ran out of power in the middle of Kansas or something like that. It's really quite amusing. But here you have this contrast where we're told the market's going to work and people, and we're going to get maximum efficiency. And we also see the range anxiety is the greatest fear. Yet there's this conflict that you just illustrated very clearly.
Yeah, and the batteries are a really expensive component of the vehicle too. So the more batteries you have, the more expensive the vehicle is.
So is the market broken, or don't we understand?
Yeah, is the market broken? I think what manufacturers are doing are building cars that consumers think they like and want. It was someone from Polestar, maybe the CEO or one of the chief designers, that said something to the effect of, I'm willing to sacrifice efficiency for some style of the vehicle. So I think, I've had people say, like, why do Teslas have to look so funny? People are not used to these shapes, and I think legacy manufacturers are scared to produce something that people aren't going to buy. But yeah, I do see that there is a disconnect between you can make a car very efficient and therefore make it less expensive, smaller batteries, and just potentially easier to build too, but we don't see the market doing that yet. And is it because the market isn't mature yet? That it's all this, when we have a new technology and it enters the market, those products aren't totally optimized for anything really, for efficiency, for user experience. And as the manufacturers iterate on their designs and improve them, they may or not get more efficient, but they get to be this product that users really like and benefit from. Otherwise, they wouldn't sell it. So I guess my response is that we're still on version 1, and there's been a focus on getting vehicles to market quickly, so maybe some shortcuts on aerodynamics, and since battery prices have dropped, maybe it's better to just get the vehicles out there and people buying them than trying to get costs down right now. But yeah, you are right in identifying that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're looking at it economically.
Great. Thank you. I think right now is a good time to start the break. Is Sam our next presenter here? Okay, excellent. Would you like to start at 3:10 or 3 o'clock?
I can do 3. It's fine.
Okay, well, we'll start.
3:10 is fine too, whatever you want to do.
Who would like to take a break until 3:10? which is the scheduled break. Who would like to start at 3? Who would like to start their comeback at 3? Okay, 3:10. So I'm hearing that we should come back at 3:10. All right. Thanks, everyone. Is it, I'm pulling them from, hold on one second, let me end this. I only have the PDF version, but I have my movie 6. Is that your movie?
Yeah, probably not.
You can put your PowerPoint version on here.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I have a
Yeah.
flash drive.
so sorry.
You're fine. It's really not integral to anything, so it's no big deal.
Okay, okay. I'm curious though.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, it's only for output.
Huh. No, it isn't.
Okay, so
Because
it was able to.
because
You're able to do this one.
this one works.
Okay. Well, I can put it on there then.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, otherwise you will not be able to come back. It's crazy. Also, can we still get a 5 visa?
No, actually, like for me,
One.
yes,
I don't know.
yeah, but I mean, like, as I know that there are certain people they can get. It's kind of like something a lottery, right? It's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, last year I put yeah, in kinds of
Enroll. Did Enroll go? Sam DeMonico. Okay.
I heard about that, but I never joined it.
I know, yeah, because
How many people there?
20 also.
Who is this? Aha.
Okay, but I mean, like, in that case, okay, so all of them are PhDs. So yeah.
Okay. This should work because it worked earlier. Okay.
Oh my gosh, I tried both of mine. It's so crazy.
Okay.
So it's just this one, yeah.
This one right here?
This.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just open right and let's not transfer all over the place so that. Okay, there you are, and Sam is right there. Ha ha. Cool.
Nice.
Okay. Zoom. My Zoom is done, so I can close that.
I mean, actually that's why a lot of international students or workers
Okay. we have your presentation here,
Okay, awesome.
and over here we have your
Video. Perfect. Thank you so much. This is great. I had no idea there was a screen back here. Otherwise, I was gonna be like, have to look over here all the time. It's the same, yeah. Okay. Okay, cool. Oh, you're gonna introduce me. Okay.
Oh, sorry guys, you can hear me walk in. All right, we're going to start the last session of the day, and I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Sam D'Amico from Impulse Labs. He is going to present on driving electrification with integrated batteries. I'm going to introduce you by reading your bio first. Good? All right. Sam D'Amico is founder and CEO of Impulse, a San Francisco-based hardware startup focused on driving electrification through next-generation home appliances. Impulse's first product is a battery-integrated induction stove that solves common installation challenges, unlocks impressive performance, and provides grid energy storage. Sam comes from an extensive background in hardware engineering and has worked on consumer tech across Meta and Google. I'm pleased to turn it over to Sam.
Thanks a bunch for the intro. So let's get started. So basically, the transition from fossil fuels is going to drive massive increases in home electricity demand, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. And the grid in our existing homes aren't able to support that in all likelihood, especially because we're looking at like a 2x increase in capacity. We solve this issue by placing battery storage inside home appliances as they get upgraded. So we basically solve for the new peak demand instantly. But what this also does is it makes the mass electrification of home appliances, which is being driven by tailwinds like the IRA and other local policies, into an opportunity to do mass deployment of energy storage across the grid. So I'm sure everyone saw all the culture war stuff about gas stoves. They've been front and center in trending topics around electrification, probably like the trending topic because it's the one user-facing piece of drama on the or appliance and piece of drama in the electrification space. And there's all this talk about gas bans, bans of gas bans, and all this other stuff. But now it's kind of like a lot of people want an induction stove now, but what does that mean? Typical induction cooktops and ranges need a 60-amp breaker, which is identical to a Tesla L2 charger. And so that's a lot, especially given many homes in California that are wired or intended to have gas supply a lot of their home energy needs are wired for like a 125 amp circuit or 125 or 100 amp panel, which is not a lot. So let's look into what it actually takes to do an upgrade. So electrifying your home is complicated and expensive. So we're looking at maybe like $500 to actually put that new circuit underneath your kitchen counter. And in many homes, it's a new panel as well, and that's like a $3,000 exercise. The last bit is really painful, and it's literally visible on my block. My neighbor's been waiting 8 months for a service upgrade. I'm guessing it's to a 320 amp panel from a 125 amp panel with all the home electrical work complete. And you actually can see here, like, they're currently wired up to their legacy connection, and then there's this much fatter wires that are just like waiting for PG&E to come connect them. Service upgrade times in SF are 12 to 18 months, and cost can be in excess of 10 grand. So this kind of goes into like what the constraints in the energy system are today. So like there's variable supply from renewable sources, and transmission is generally undersized, and we're all talking about permitting reform and all this other stuff to increase transmission capacity. There's also variable demand from residential users, like people are home from like 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. and using most of the electricity then. And we've also undersized transformer capacity and home wiring for like the looming electrified future. So like your panel is in your home service connection, your panel are not ready for an EV, an induction stove, or maybe all of these things all at once. So there's a ton of supply constraints and bottlenecks in the existing system, and we really need to look to fixing that. Our approach is home appliances basically haven't changed in 50 years. This is like when people got microwaves, when people got when induction stoves first got invented. This presents a huge opportunity for innovation and improvement by like catching up appliances to like modern technology capabilities. And what if we could leverage that appliance upgrade as a simple entry point into home energy storage? So we basically put a battery inside the appliances to solve this. Most large home appliances are used intermittently. So by putting a small, like order of magnitude 3 kilowatt hour battery, which is sized for the tax credit benefit primarily, you convert something that may be ordinarily draw 40 to 60 amps into something that can work at 15 amps at 120 volts. This means we can fully electrify homes even with small 100 amp panels. The appliances are higher performance than before. We're actually able to do about 3x normal induction performance on our stove because there's a local high-power DC bus. We're actually deploying DC appliances for the first time ever in a sense. And you can install it with whatever wiring you've already got available. We also massively increase grid storage, and that's kind of the second play of what we're doing. So this is a backdoor, democratized terascale battery play. There's 140 million homes in America. The appliances in each home are basically getting replaced at a 10-year rate. If 3 major appliances per home have embedded batteries, we'd add 1.4 terawatt hours of storage to the grid by adding about 10 kilowatt hours of home storage. And as I said before, like we're replacing appliances every 10 years. This is an opportunity to add much, much more storage than is currently being added to the grid just through these appliance upgrades that are likely to start happening in the next couple of years. And to enable this, we actually, our products enable 2 different ways to install them. One, to enable compatibility, and 2, also maximize the chances you'll be able to actually use the appliance for storage for the rest of the house. So we can work off of a 120 volt plug. This could be like the plug that runs the ignition for your gas stove or is just in your basement near a water heater or something of that nature. Or we can run off of a 240 volt 8 to 10 amp breaker, which means we won't actually strain your panel capacity, but you could wire it exactly where an induction or like an electric stove was already put in today. In the hardwire case, we're actually able to push power back into the house, and we've got a UL 1741 listed inverter in our production plans to enable that. And in some sense, it's like it installs identically to a 440 volt appliance today. Like there's no change, but the reverse power capability enables it to offset other home loads as well. Looking into what the regulatory environment looks like in Europe is actually kind of interesting from a forward-looking perspective. So there's balcony solar programs that enable you to backfeed into a plug, which is definitely not something that's in the roadmap in the US National Electric Code to my knowledge, but is like very interesting that they allow this. And what's interesting is 600 watts, it enables us to actually leverage the entire home battery capacity, or the whole entire appliance level battery capacity within a typical time of use window. So there's actually some really exciting capabilities out in the European market already that we could look to as inspiration in the US. What's also interesting is because we're putting batteries right at the peak load, there's kind of this virtual power line potential that you can do where there's a tandem usage of utility scale batteries and home batteries to minimize the demand for wiring and transmission all the way up and down the chain. And so it's kind of like a virtual power line, but like brought all the way into the home, into like almost to the outlet. And so we're looking at this as like a potential like sea change in the architecture of how you can actually approach the transmission bottleneck problems that we're seeing coming up as we electrify. So the way we're starting with this is make the best appliances, period, because there's not going to be any way to get these things into people's houses unless you have the best appliances. So our play is it works better than any other stove on the market. We're about 3x the performance of any induction stove because of the local DC bus and super high power power electronics that we developed internally. We can boil a liter of water in about 40 seconds. So that's like my gas stove takes 400 seconds to do the same thing. And we've got an interactive display and a bunch of new control innovations that we're going to roll out in the next couple months and announce that should be highly differentiated from anyone else in the market. Our product strategy basically goes into every product we release has a battery and inverter, and it internally runs off of DC. Every appliance can run for multiple usages in a power outage scenario, so there's a resilience play built into the appliance even before we've deployed enough home battery storage to actually run your home from a resiliency point of view. And then this builds into a whole home and whole grid battery strategy, as I mentioned earlier. We're planning on shipping a whole range of kitchen and other home appliances in the coming years, all leveraging common components that we've developed primarily for the stove to start, and with an equivalent approach to home wiring and installation. So they'll all be flexible in the same ways. And then the last thing is I've got a video kind of showing some of the performance stuff we've actually been able to pull off in the last couple years. This is actually about a year-old video. To be clear, we've made many strides since then, and we'll actually be sharing more about what we've been able to do in the coming months. So an example is this: we can boil a liter of water in 40 seconds. On the left is my gas stove that takes 400 seconds. And you can actually see that you're already starting to see the water boil within, or the bottom of the pot boiling within 10 seconds or so. So a watch pot does boil, technically. I can't believe I'm showing a water boiling video to a conference, by the way. It's very silly. And part of the argument here is you have to really differentiate, because otherwise there's going to be questions of like, well, why wouldn't I just get a Miele or Bosch or Thermador or what have you, any of these great brands, and then pay to upgrade my panel in all these cases? And it's like, we're making sure that there is a desire to get this product, even if you've got enough panel capacity and a hardwired 240 volt connection in your kitchen. So that's it.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, questions.
It's about the size. It's about this big, and the idea is it fits like the stove itself is about the thickness of like on the chunkier side of like electric and induction stovetops. The battery just slides in, and it kind of defines the maximum thickness of the product. But like the goal is we don't clear the next drawer that you want to use in your kitchen. Yeah, we've talked. I think the playbook is build out the full, like, there's a bunch of regulatory and compliance angles that we have to get right to ship the first product. And once we have that figured out, there's actually a really, as you mentioned, there's a really good strategy for licensing and cross applicability, both for the battery and the inverter, because those are kind of difficult and high barrier to entry pieces to make that are optimized for this use case.
Are there any product safety issues, challenges, or considerations? And given that the kitchen can be a humid environment, how does that impact the battery longevity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're engaged directly with like underwriters laboratories and other compliance firms. We've got a lot of folks with strong background in consumer electronics and battery tech, so we've actually been able to kind of follow the best practices there. There's a relatively prescribed compliance playbook to make this work, and we're working. Part of our strategy is to work with vendors that have done this before, so that we check the boxes in a responsible way versus like walk into the unknown. For the like kitchen as a human environment and all these other things, like we're aware of all the environmental challenges here, and that's part of, we build that into the product spec basically. I actually think the biggest thing is actually fire safety and perceived fire safety risk from the battery side. The battery pack is LFP. And there's a playbook to pass kind of the most stringent UL fire safety standards, or like it's UL 9540, 9540A, as part of that.
my question is kind of related to that one. So I wanted to ask the role that thermal management plays regarding batteries on this application, because generally that's kind of like a huge issue when you use batteries.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple things that are really fun about this. So one is a big challenge with home batteries is they could be installed outside and be in the sun or in the cold. In some sense, we actually have a narrower range of temperatures that we operate in than a typical home battery system because of an absence of sun loading and the fact that your house doesn't actually get super hot or super cold in most cases. But we're still making it with manufacturers that make the like at volume home energy storage systems that can sit outside basically.
I have lots of questions, but I guess I'll start with this sort of silly one. About 20% of all stoves adjoin refrigerators. They're physically next to it if you go into a kitchen, which is always thermally a questionable practice to be heating your refrigerator with your stove. But in any event, are you describe how you're thinking about exporting that electricity? Right now, it sounds like you're just having an inverter going to back to put the surplus power into the house. But is it possible that you can feed directly into a refrigerator that is also using DC?
Yeah, you could actually. It's actually an interesting question. If you had an inverter refrigerator, you could totally do that. I think we're open to interesting collaborations there. To be clear, and that's the DC refrigerator. I overheard you mention something around Ethernet because that Ethernet for power transmission. There's some interesting work on that side. I think likely not in the first product, but it's something that we're definitely open to collaborating and talking about.
So they're increasingly being offered these power centers. It's a battery with all sorts of different plug outlets on them. They'll have 115 volts. I don't know if I've seen 220, but it's a battery that you can carry with some difficulty, but you can carry it. And it's got various kinds of DC and now increasingly USB power delivery. That's the 100 watt plus. And USB-A and all this stuff. Are you looking at those guys and just thinking, look at all those outputs they have? Is that something that might be on the back of your stove?
I think there's a sense where the product cost and competitiveness in that market is going. The cost is going to zero and the competitiveness is off the charts. Like I get targeted ads for all these products all the time, every single day because of the space I'm in a sense. I actually think we want to be reasonably focused and deliver a product that excels as a stove. And there is an ancillary home battery benefit, but in some sense, there's also a reliability cost to having all these ports and connectivity, and especially given that it's only usable in the resilience case versus the P99 case, where you're very likely wanting your stove just to work as a stove, basically.
So one use case is selling electricity to the grid, or reducing your own electricity. But that implies that you need to have communications to know when to do it.
Yep.
So what sorts of communications inputs are you imagining?
So we're building a vertically integrated system to start with in-panel communications to make this work. We'll probably have more to share on that early next year is our guess on that exact strategy and playbook, but the plan is there is an in-panel communications play to enable that.
Can you talk about repairability? Which will last longer, the stove or the battery, and if one fails, is it going to be costly? Anything you can say along those lines?
So from a supply chain perspective, the battery and the stove are shipped to the US in separate boxes and separate containers by separate manufacturers. And they're designed to it's a 4-screw and a slide-in situation for the battery install with a connector that is designed for multiple mating cycles. So you're able to technically swap the battery from the stove independently without it having to go back to a service depot or anything like that. From an aging perspective, even if you look in the most aggressive case, so there's kind of two scenarios. There's like you use the stove as a just as a stove, and it's like on a 120 volt plug, and you're not doing any sort of time of use or anything. Typical stove usage is like hundreds of watt hours a day, I think, based on DOE data. So the battery cycling might be once a week in terms of like effective cycling. And then on the extreme case, it's like you're cycling it once a day within the time of use window effectively. And so if you kind of look at those extreme cases, one case is dominated by battery aging, like physically it gets older, and then the other case is dominated by the cycling. We're seeing the use of the battery doesn't really keel over when it gets below 70% or something like that. Like there's not really range anxiety with products like this because in some sense it's being used as a, so to speak, because you're in some sense it's just being used to boost the power. There's kind of like the minimum you get one meal, which is a kilowatt hour. So you really have to get down there in terms of cycles to kind of get the usage to be like, meaningfully worse from a product value proposition perspective. So it kind of is like the replacement cycle for the appliance and for the battery are remarkably similar. But because of the realities of the supply chain and how this works, we're capable of servicing them separately.
I was just wondering, conversation we started down there but didn't finish, but what, if any, plans do you have to include a resiliency plug that is available to the homeowner for them to plug something in the event of an outage?
Technically, there's a hidden USB port on the bottom of the unit that I think will send power back to your phone. But it's the goal here is, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think the prevalence of these like home battery products that provide like phone, laptop, et cetera, short-term resiliency plays, probably, and a lot of them are powerful enough to power a fridge now, makes it, we want to make sure that we're focused and deliver really strong value prop as a stove and as a backdoor battery play to start.
What market forces are at play here for your product? So there'll be some market forces that are going to be helping you, and there'll be some market forces that might be hurting you. One being replacement of gas stoves, because you mentioned that you still have your gas stove. So yeah, could you go over those?
Get my government hands off my gas stove. But yeah, in any event, like there's like all of this stuff which is happening, and there's actually a really funny situation, which is, where are the gas stoves actually? They're all in coastal areas where we built out gas networks for lighting early on. Like I can literally make a gas lighting joke about this. And they're not necessarily in quote unquote real America as is described by certain cable news channels. And so what's interesting is there's actually a negative polarization around like the gas ban discussion that's pushing a lot of people to consider getting induction stoves when previously they're like, I want to get my high-end kitchen, I'm going to go get a Wolf gas range, and I really want the red knobs. We'll consider making red knobs, by the way, but that's a different topic for later. I'm not going to promise anything. Yeah, like there's definitely a negative polarization effect happening, and like where the gas stoves are actually deployed is like coastal cities and like suburban areas that are over 100 years old in a certain sense. That's definitely a tailwind, I think, in the short term. In the long term, like getting the long tail of a bunch of this stuff is a big problem. Also, it's like where we actually can sell the storage product just straight up immediately is a lot of these markets where people already have electric stoves. And so part of the pitch is like, this is just a better stove than your existing electric stove. We've solved a bunch of issues around stoves. We're doing fully custom power electronics. A big story with induction is that about 50% of induction stoves use one vendor. So they have almost the same user experience across all of these products. And so we're able to actually offer a pretty differentiated product experience there. And we'll talk about that more next year, but with the idea that like we could actually go and pitch and win someone who has no wiring constraints to install our product. And we don't necessarily want to antagonize that person, if that makes any sense. So I do view that as like a potential headwind as well, because there's people with electric stoves that we're going to want to convert it and get storage into their house. Other things are the IRA. So a big story is, because we've got a battery and inverter, we are effectively a 3 kilowatt hour ESS system and thus are eligible for the tax credit straight up. There's some discussion on whether you can get it on a 120 volt plug without pushing power back. I think the answer is that's a maybe, and we'll see what happens there. But like with the idea that the IRS is looking at that positively because it solves the like deployment of renewable energy use case versus detracts from it. And there's not actually a strict requirement that like, hey, if you put a Tesla Powerwall on a sub panel that has your stove, you'd still get the tax credit today, for instance. So it's like technically you could get a tax credit for an equivalent install today. So that's definitely a tailwind. And the big deal with the tax credits is they decoupled them from requiring home solar to predominantly charge it. And so what that means is we can sell into multifamily or places that have no use case or no place to install solar, and they can still get a tax incentivized battery install.
Oh, Alan, are you okay with holding or? Okay.
I'll be around afterwards for more questions as well. So.
And everyone, don't forget, we'll have the panel discussion, which includes both Sam and Alan. So that'll be exciting. All right. So our last speaker is Dr. Eva Allen. She is going to be speaking on ReCell, working to advance battery recycling. She is from Argonne National Laboratory. Dr. Eva Allen did her PhD work in organic chemistry at the University of Illinois, Chicago in Dr. Jordi Cabana's research group. During her PhD, she designed and built a continuous stirred tank reactor to synthesize core shell cathode minerals with enhanced capacity, retention, and cyclability using co-precipitation. Since graduating from UIC, Dr. Allen is now a postdoc at the ReCell Center focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries. She's currently developing synthetic methods to renew and increase the capacity of directly recycled cathodes for the second use applications. Additionally, she is exploring the effects of impurities on the synthesis and performance of cathode materials made from recycled metal salts. Turn it over to Dr. Allen.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to go last, especially for battery recycling, so all the motivation is there already. So Jeff Spangenberg was originally going to be here today. He's the director of ReCell, but unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I'm happy to speak on his behalf, talking about some of the great work that ReCell is doing to advance battery recycling. So Catherine had a lot of great graphs showing the exponential growth of battery use, and especially for electric vehicle purposes. And what's the other end of that? We're going to have also an exponential growth of spent battery waste. And we don't want it to be waste. So here is this graph showing, let me get a little laser pointer up here. On the y-axis, the volume of spent batteries as a function of time. And we can see that this graph starts in the future, the next year and a half. And we're only a blip on this graph. And we can see that up to 2040, it's going to exponentially increase to about 8 million metric tons of waste battery at their end of their life. So ultimately, we want to keep these batteries out of the landfill, right? We don't want to solve one climate problem by introducing another climate problem, as well as there's a lot of valuable materials left over in these batteries that need to be reused to support this electric vehicle and grid storage economy. So some of these critical materials, this critical material assessment report put out from the DOE in July. So this looks at the medium-term criticality of these elements present, both due to their importance in energy as well as their supply risk. And we look here in the red, the critical region, we have lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and now graphite in this critical regime. And this is due to both their supply risk, right? We don't have a lot of domestic reserves of these resources. Lithium, we have less than 10% of global resources here in the United States. Nickel, cobalt, it's less than 1%. And now looking at supply risk, just last Friday, China announced that they're going to do export controls on high purity graphite for energy purposes. So this really presents the need for a domestic supply so we can assure that we have enough materials to support the economy. They're critical because they're hard to replace. I know we're having lithium iron phosphate come into the market, but you really can't replace nickel, cobalt, manganese cathode materials for their energy density purposes and properties. So this leads to the motivation. We want to keep batteries out of landfills, like I said. We also want to reduce our reliance on foreign countries. We also want to reduce the environmental impact of creating new batteries, so preventing further mining of these resources from our ground crust or seawater. So what are we doing to combat this and recycle batteries? So as I showed previously on this graph, we're only a small blip on the supply of the future of end-of-life batteries. So we don't have enough supply currently to develop these technologies. So we're looking at other sources, such as electronic devices, so our consumer devices. There's about 152 million of cell phones being thrown away in the US every year, but most aren't returned back to us. They're not collected, right? If you're like my household, you probably have a drawer full of old cell phones and laptop batteries. So a lot of work is needed to inform the consumer community on how to return their devices for recycling purposes and incentivize that. Just this last summer, DOE put a funding opportunity out for just developing policies for the collection of consumer devices for this purpose. And then a majority of the material for recycling will be coming from manufacturing scrap. About 80% of that material will be used for recycling in the year 2025. This manufacturing scrap supply comes from original battery manufacturing. So when you're punching an electrode, you're going to have leftover foil with your cathode material still deposited on that foil. So that material will be recycling, as well as batteries that already been maybe undergone formation cycling. So initial cycling and then did not meet any quality control spec maybe. So those batteries are also going to waste that we're now taking and recycling for new batteries. But ultimately, we're developing these separation technologies on these two feedstocks to be ready for that large wave that is coming in the year 2040. Right? We already mentioned that there's about 100 million vehicles on the road today. That's a huge increase if you look 10 to 15 years ago, a lot less. And these batteries have about a 10-15 year lifetime, even though you can get a battery warranty for your car about 8 to 10 years. Usually you keep it a little bit longer. So it's going to be, from this 1 million vehicles on the road, it's going to take that amount of time to actually get to the recycling. So Argonne's working together with researchers and battery development, process optimization, scale-up recycling, and modeling expertise. Argonne National Lab has a long history for battery development. So we're pivoting to the recycling field. So we're leading this DOE Resell Center for Advanced Battery Recycling. And we're partnering with multiple national labs, which I'll show in the next couple slides, academia, but also mostly important industry along the way and even the initial stages of development of these processes. We're working with companies to identify what they need, what challenges they face, and how we can solve them. We also work in other areas of recycling, critical materials recycling, plastics recycling, and electronic waste. But this leads me to the Resell Center kind of main focus here is developing these cost-effective, flexible processing technologies to extract as much value as possible from these current and future battery chemistries. And really the main goal is to make this recycling economically viable, profitable, because that's the only way that this is going to be adopted domestically. So here's the national labs that we're working with: Oak Ridge National Lab, NREL, good to see some representatives of there today, and Idaho National Lab, as well as many universities. We do this through these 4 focus areas, our main one being this direct recycling. So Resell started in 2019, and it was mostly focused on direct recycling of the cathode, the more valuable part of the battery. And I'll go into what direct recycling means in the next few slides. We have, that's our largest focus areas with 26 projects. We also have advanced resource recovery. So this is recapturing materials for reuse in batteries, or other applications through this chemical conversion. So breaking them more down into their salt or ionic form or metallic form for reuse. We also have design for sustainability. So how can we work with battery manufacturers or vehicle manufacturers to design both their chemistries based off material choice, the design of their packs and battery modules, so that downstream it will be easier to recycle. And I know that's a really hard motivation, right? A lot of these OEMs make their battery packs as stable as possible, right? They're welding packs together or cells together into a pack, or gluing them together so they're stable. But downstream, that makes it really hard to recycle. So how can we motivate them to actually think about recycling when they're creating their materials? We can do a lot of modeling and analysis along the way. One of the main tools we have with RECELL is the EverBat model. Cheng Dai created that model for both techno-economic analysis, life cycle analysis of these recycling processes. And we do this modeling at every step of the process development, from the creation of the separation process to scale up. It's really important to have the immediate impact of these separation technologies from creation to optimization, so we can directly deliver that to industry. So one example of that is we had a process that used a solvent such as ethanol, and they found that that really decreased the profitability of that process. So by just replacing that solvent, you can kind of increase the economic impact of this process. So this brings me to how you actually do battery recycling. So there's a lot of companies today, domestically as well as worldwide, that do these first two processes of pyro processing and hydro processing. Pyro processing is basically you're taking your battery and heating it to higher temperatures to melt down the materials into their metallic forms for then further refining and then reuse and cathode production reuse. Hydro processing is using an aqueous method, usually acidic solutions, to leach out those materials and then produce them into their ionic or salt forms. So for cathode production, you're using sulfate chemistry, so producing that sulfate salt to manufacture your cathode. Catherine did a really good job talking about the cost of producing electric vehicles, and she highlighted that the cost associated is mainly the battery. I want to break that down further. It's usually the cathode. The cathode is the most expensive part of creating that battery. So as you can imagine, if we have to take it all the way back to the raw material standpoint and remanufacture that battery, it's going to contribute to the cost and ultimately kind of cut down on the profit of a recycling of these batteries. So here we can see kind of the crystalline forms that you would need to create the cathode material, as well as morphologies of the cathode material, really important for packing in as much energy density. So instead, RECELL is mainly focused on direct recycling. So how can we use separation technologies already pulling from the recycling field in general? So automotive recycling is a really efficient process at this point. So we're pulling in some of the separation technologies from that field while building our own and trying to get our material back out in its more intact form. So kind of retaining that crystalline structure, the morphology of the cathode material especially, that we can do minor processing steps for reuse. So this brings me to the full direct recycling process, where we're getting our end-of-life batteries. These are in the cell form. So I don't show the battery pack. I hear that disassembly of the battery pack is more economically viable than actually shredding the whole battery pack at this point. Basically, after disassembly, we have our cells. We shred them in a custom-built shredder. We wash those battery shreds, and then we can recover our lithium hexafluorophosphate, which is the main salt component in your electrolyte, which we can then reuse. Then we have our cathode anodes still deposited on our current collecting foils of aluminum and copper, and we can use metallic separation to separate anode and cathode. We can then delaminate our cathode coating and then burn off our PVDF binder through a binder burn-off process. And then we have our cathode separated. When we have our cathode, we still need to rejuvenate that. That mainly means, for sure, relithiation. Since these materials are at their end of life, usually your capacity decreases due to these degradative mechanisms of lithium consumption. So they already at a lithium deficit for reuse. But also through these recycling processes, you can have lithium leaching out of the material. Though we take some of the waste streams to then recover that lithium using electrodialysis. So we need to relithiate that material, add more lithium back in, heat to high temperatures, and you have your rejuvenated cathode material. We also can undergo upcycling. I'll go through that a little bit more in a deeper dive in a project that I work on, but basically making a higher value cathode from the previous composition of the end-of-life battery material. But ultimately, you have this rejuvenated cathode that can be added to a new battery, maybe in a small percentage. Already, the European Union is looking at incentives to motivate the original battery manufacturers to incorporate a percentage of recycled material into their batteries, though the supply is not there yet. So it's great that they're thinking about it, but we need the supply first. So we accomplished a lot of these recycling technologies through the Resell Center, which occupies a 3,000 square foot high bay space that incorporates both bench and pilot scale labs. And this is at the Material Engineering Research Facility, Argonne National Lab. So some of the equipment that I like to highlight here is our custom built shredder for shredding our batteries. We can do this under water environment, a nitrogen environment. And we also monitor any heat releases with thermal imaging camera, right? Ideally, our batteries are at a discharge state, but you can't control for that ever or always, especially in a recycling facility when you're getting these battery packs from all these different suppliers. So you will sometimes have a charged state battery, and when you shred it, it is an explosion. We also have sorting equipment such as an optical sorter. This uses machine learning to be able to sort anode and cathode based off of their color, shape, and size properties. This actually is from Japan. It's used widely in the rice industry for separating rice grains. So that kind of precision we can now use in battery recycling. Froth flotation, this is for separating out anode and cathode powders based off of their surface properties. Your anode graphite is hydrophobic, cathode is hydrophilic, so you can separate them off of that from those properties. Continuous rotary kiln, which we use for continuous thermal binder removal of the cathode powders, as well as relithiation. And we also have a lot of other equipment that I'm not showing here. We have other material recycling capabilities. A lot of this equipment was left over from I shouldn't say a long time ago, but when Jeff originally started at Argonne National Lab, he was working in the recycling field and used some of this pilot scale equipment for other recycling purposes, such as electronic waste, toner cartridges, household appliance, et cetera. So we have large and wet separation systems that are capable of handling 11 pounds per hour to 4,000 pounds per hour. And then we have these magnetic separation equipment, such as a rare earth magnetic drum for separating ferrous metals, eddy current separator for separating non-ferrous metals, and aspirator cyclone equipment for removing light materials such as your foam and thin plastics from your heavier, denser materials. So this brings me to a project that I started on in the last year and a half, looking at both the relithiation and upcycling of cathode materials. So why do we need an upcycling process? I keep reiterating that you need to make these processes profitable, right? And if we're getting cathode material or these batteries at the end of life, they're already about 10 to 15 years at that point. So looking back, those chemistries are probably no longer relevant for energy storage needs for electric vehicles today. And looking back 10 to 15 years ago, that means that the definition is it's a lower nickel cathode compared to a higher nickel cathode used in today. So we find that by adding more nickel into this end-of-life cathode material, we can reach a higher nickel composition and then alternatively reach a higher energy density. So this is the definition of upcycling currently, but this will continuously change as our feedstock changes. That's one of the largest difficulties with recycling, right? The feedstock is continuously changing. So here I'm using a co-precipitation method. So co-precipitation is kind of your main chemistry process for originally making these spherical particle agglomerated cathode materials of lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese with a precursor of nickel, cobalt, manganese hydroxide. Basically, I'm coating our end-of-life cathode material with a NMC 111 composition with a high nickel-rich hydroxide shell. And then during the relithiation processes, higher temperatures, that nickel-rich shell will diffuse into the structure of the material, basically converting your NMC 111 bulk composition to an NMC 622 composition. And while relying on this co-precipitation process, it's an aqueous-based process, and it occurs under ambient pressure. It uses the same infrastructure already there present in battery manufacturing technology, such as a continuous stir tank reactor, basically a tank reactor with an overhead stir and an output valve. That's all you really need. So here's some of the SEM images of the cathode material upcycled. We can see our precursor material with our end-of-life cathode material in the center with our nickel-rich shell on the outside. We can see that we retain that spherical secondary particle agglomerated morphology. And then at higher temperatures, we can see the diffusion of the nickel-rich shell into the bulk composition. I won't show too much data on this. I don't want to go too technical, but we basically create a single phase looking at crystalline data with an X-ray diffraction. Here's the precursor material with a shifted peak indicative of a lower nickel cathode down to a single peak at a higher nickel cathode. But even though we have this kind of observation that we have kind of a homogeneous cathode material at this higher nickel content, we are increasing our initial capacity from 155 to 164 milliamperes per gram, but we're still not getting the density gains that we would expect for a bulk, higher nickel cathode composition. So here I'm pulling in some of the work that I did my PhD using a higher resolution imaging method called tomographic transmission X-ray microscopy. This is a fully non-destructive three-dimensional imaging technique where we can analyze both the morphology, internal, external morphology of these cathode materials, as well as elemental composition and oxidation state composition, or oxidation state heterogeneity, using the advanced photon source at Argonne National Lab. So basically you can select a single wavelength of light, then you can analyze the elemental and oxidation state composition. Basically taking X-ray projection images across the XZ and YZ plane as our material is being rotated. And from that, you can reconstruct your cross-sectional slices shown here. And from this, we can better scrutinize this ability to relithiate and upcycle the material. Here we can see from a cross-sectional slice, so this is one slice of data through the full three-dimensional volume of data. We can see a precursor material with a nickel-rich coating. At 750 degrees C, we can see a nickel-rich coating of the secondary particle, but we see some diffusion of the nickel-rich coating into the bulk. And then at higher and higher temperatures, we can see further diffusion. But with this higher sensitive imaging technique, we can now see the issue here, where we see a higher nickel coating around the grain boundary of the primary particles. So it's diffusion limited still. So this higher energy density, higher reactive coating across the grain boundaries will also affect basically your capacity retention of the material. So now we have a path forward to scrutinize these upcycling and relithiation processes to kind of control for this heterogeneity and improve upon it with all these various upcycling processes. Oh, I think I'm frozen here. Okay, there we go. And just to show you that this is three-dimensional data, you can raster through the volume of a material and kind of visualize the full cross-section of these materials, showing that this is the case across the full volume of material. So I just wanted to highlight this project. We were able to deliver these kind of fast, effective methodologies for converting low nickel composition cathodes to higher nickel composition cathodes, but we still have a long way to go. And the feedstock is continuously changing. So across RECELL, from every step of the direct recycling process, we have many different researchers working on different paths. And that's really important so that we can handle these different feedstocks. And I wanted to highlight kind of the imaging method because we are tackling battery recycling not only from a separation standpoint, but from an advanced characterization standpoint, so we can gain these fundamental knowledge that is required to provide these recycled cathodes for reuse. So in conclusion, I'd like to talk about collaboration with the RECELL Center. All right, we're working together, both industry, academia, and definitely the national lab space, to solve these recycling challenges and bridge these gaps from the discovery phase of the separation, upcycling, relithiation technologies, but also scaling up. And that's something in my group at Argonne National Lab and the Material Engineering Research Facility, that's what we kind of specialize in, process development of scale up of these processes. So taking these bench scale research to scale up and then to further demonstration of unit operations. And to be able to do that, we're expanding. So here's our expansion space here. We're going to be adding this 12,000 square foot high bay space that will be capable of handling these pilot scale equipment for the full direct recycling process. So this is basically effectively expanding us 4 times. And some of those equipment that I was showing you will be increased tenfold. So basically, each day we'll be able to handle 10 kgs of material per day. So if we're running this equipment every day that Argonne's open, that's about 2.5 tons per year. But ultimately, we're going to use this to work very closely with industry to not only provide the scale up, but the demonstrations so that we can immediately be impactful to the field. Just to further iterate this, here's some of the already pilot scale equipment that we have that will be going into this space. Pilot scale electrodialysis equipment. So this is, as I mentioned previously, some of the waste, that lithium leaching from maybe these separation processes that use aqueous solutions, we can then effectively convert that solution into battery-grade lithium hydroxide, as well as look at alternative feedstock for lithium supply, such as geothermal brines and seawater brines. Pilot scale aspiration equipment for removing light materials, as well as these custom-built magnetic separation equipment for separating anode and cathode. Currently, RECELL holds about 20 patent applications for these separation technologies and about 50 publications, and we're continually growing. Each spring, we hold an industry collaboration meeting. This is really important. I just had my first one this last spring, and I can't believe, the things as a chemist I don't think about, right? Thinking about from a battery manufacturing level, one of the main cost prohibitive steps in recycling is transportation. So how do we aggregate, how do we transport these materials, as well as things like what does it mean for a battery warranty or insurance purposes when you incorporate recycled material? These are the questions we need to know and continually ask between the researchers developing these processes and then the industry stakeholders. So we'll be having another meeting in 2024, so I hope to see some of you there. And here's just some of the partnerships and collaborations, a few that I mentioned already, but here's some of the industry collaborators, as well as the full RECELL team across all national labs and universities. All right, thank you, and here's my email.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I wanted to know if the geometry of the battery affects like the recycling part.
So not too much. We've done both the cylindrical cell format, the pack format. Yeah, I guess the pouch cell, it's a little bit easier to separate the light pouch cell material from the denser material, right? So there could affect some of the initial separation processes with the denser metal casings.
Thank you.
For building the cathode? Yeah, so cathode manufacturing, right now it does a continuous stir tank reactor. So basically these very large tank reactors that overhead stir, input chemicals, and then output the material. And then usually you create a nickel manganese cobalt hydroxide material. Then you have a high temperature dry step where you incorporate your lithium hydroxide into the material and heat to high temperatures to create your final lithium nickel cobalt manganese oxide material. Yeah, my background's in cathode, I guess, synthesis. I started off at the Material Engineering Research Facility before my PhD. So we were kind of developing these scalable technologies for supporting industry in the battery manufacturing side. So we were also looking at kind of alternative reactors. We did Taylor vortex reactors, which really has a nice high, instead of a tank reactor with an overhead stir, you have a reactor on its side with 2 cylinders. And in that cylinder, the inner cylinder turns at really high rates and creates these vortices, higher shear mixing environment, and then you get denser. Yeah. Sure, we get most of it imported in, right? Yeah, cobalt. So most of it is mined in different countries, but they're refined mainly through China and then sold back to us. Yeah, so that's the problem, right? Because it's really a volatile market right now, as we saw with China just this last Friday, and that's continually an issue, right? We're pivoting chemistry based off of the supply chain issues. We're going from this nickel manganese cobalt material to lithium iron phosphate, mainly because of the lack of cobalt supply, as well as mining practices, right? The Congo is the main source for our cobalt material, which usually it kind of, bad mining practices as far as child labor. So something that we kind of need to reckon with. And this new supply with this end-of-life material, it gives us a path forward that's not that. Yeah.
I do have a question. So we're on the topic of materials and supply chain. What are the have you looked into the economics, and can you speak to the economics of the recycling processes that you're working on? Are they currently economically viable for recycling battery material to be produced to create new batteries in the U.S.?
Yeah, pyro-hydro processing definitely is economically viable at this point, and it's happening here. Redwood Materials is a good example of that in Nevada. Ascend Materials. There's many companies now at almost the manufacturing scale domestically doing that, though other countries like China already have their recycling infrastructure set up for hydro and pyro processing. Direct recycling is fairly new. One of the first company was Onto Technology, Steve Sloop. He's kind of the guy that pioneered direct recycling, had the first idea many years ago. They're still not at manufacturing scale, so there's startups starting right now. So Princeton New Energy is another one we work with, but they're not there yet. They're not at manufacturing scale. We see more and more companies cropping up that will be on the side of shredding the material and maybe some minor separation and creating what's called black mass. So that's your anode cathode foils combined. You're going to hear more and more about that. It's now like a publicly traded market of black mass, and people are talking about the value of black mass. So there's a lot more companies on that end, but now it's the other end. The companies that are cropping up and refining and developing the salts, but not so much to this point for direct recycling in the manufacturing scale.
Okay, that's a great answer. And then I have another question about the energy consumption of these processes. They do seem to take a lot of energy. Part of our initiative is to be decarbonized, but if we're continuing to use electricity or other fuels to drive the manufacturing processes for recycling, then that's still something to be that we would need to be working on. Can you speak a little bit more about what you know about the energy intensity? I think that's probably where we are. What's the energy intensity of the recycling processes, and what can we do to reduce that energy intensity?
Yeah, that's the main motivation for direct recycling, right? We don't want to take it back to the raw forms. As I said, the cathode production, that's the main cost associated with the electric vehicle. That's compared to a combustion engine vehicle initial production. So if we're continually having to redo that, it's going to be continually further emissions, right? I don't have the numbers, unfortunately. Cheng Dai would be the modeler for Everbat, would definitely have the numbers for you. But we do see a huge significant decrease when we look at direct recycling compared to the other pyro and hydro processing.
Okay, let's give her a hand. Thank you all for your excellent lineup of presentations today. We have another panel coming up, but I just want to take a moment right now to thank you again to all the presenters for being here today and talking about the work that you're doing. It is quite amazing and really, really encouraging to see that all of this R&D, this technology development is happening because we are reaching some of our research and development commercialization goals for the technologies that will really drive decarbonization forward. Okay, so at this time, we're going to have the panel discussion on energy storage and more. So Doug, Alan, Sam, Eva, and Katie are up here on the panel. So we have 5 of you up here now. So it's a little bit more crowded than before. There are 4. All right. Those of you who are in the audience, hope that you think of some questions, please. So this is a diverse group, and so I'm going to ask a technology question first, and then we'll turn it over to the folks in the audience. So what are some of the emerging technologies that you're seeing right now that you think are going to have significant uptake in the next 3 years? So 3 years time frame. What are those technologies that are going to have significant uptake, and what are the drivers for that?
I think the first one that's like pretty much the like stalking horse in this entire thing is when people get solar, or people got solar back in the day before NEM3, like you were not getting storage necessarily, and the financing worked out without actually having storage, and now people are looking at home batteries just generally as part of the entire solar package that you're getting. And so I think that's like most urgently the new thing that is rolling out at scale.
For many years, for decades, my organization has tracked and quantified consumer ownership of various technologies. And we have a handle on consumers' interest and appetite for backup power for their devices. Something like 55% of US households are quite used to that because they have at least one portable power solution to power a mobile phone. What we don't have a good handle on, at least in our organization of market research, is the macro side of that, large energy storage systems at the residential level. But we will start tracking that, as I understand from my market research colleagues, in January of next year. We have seen that at our trade show, CS in Las Vegas, some examples of energy storage systems by certain manufacturers and vendors. But at least consumers are comfortable with it at a micro level, and increasingly there's demand for it at a macro or household level too.
In the next 3 years, of course, battery recycling is going to grow. It's continually growing monthly, what I'm seeing. But there's still a lot of information needed as far as what battery manufacturers will need, as far as if we're direct recycling a cathode material, what are they looking for at the end point? If this industry collaboration event, we were shocked to hear a couple times that they want, when asked that question, they want cathode material that acts and looks and is the same as the pristine material. And there needs to be more information on what that actually means. What are they actually looking for? Even in the recycled salt, you mentioned in my introduction that I'm looking at how increased impurities in the recycled streams may affect the performance. What we're finding is that there's really no domestic standards on what battery grade actually means. You have that 99.999 something percentage, right? But what does that mean when you have something like metallic copper versus ionic copper? That has a large effect on the final battery material. So we need to figure out what those regulations are. But also looking at the feedstocks, the diverse feedstocks that will be coming into the recycling field. Recycling companies right now they're able to control enough where they just take all the feedstock from one company and they'll just process that together. And then once that clean all the equipment, then do the next feedstock. So we need more information on where these batteries have been, what are they made up of, and a lot of companies won't give up that information. So a lot of work is being done as far as coming up with like a battery passport, so like a digital twin, as far as what is in the battery, what has it been used for previously, so what we can expect in recyclability of the material.
I like that battery passport idea. Could you repeat the question? I know that sounds silly, but I just want to make sure I'm answering the right one.
No, I'm curious to what your thoughts are on technologies that are emerging in the next 3 years that
All right, so I was trying to decide which way to go here. I think the communications protocol, such as Matter, will be the one that's just going to just explode, because everything's going to be talking to each other inside the building. But if you want to talk about something that you can actually see, then it's probably going to be heat pumps. I hate to say it, but there they are.
Yeah, I'll agree that the IoT protocols is really a really important part of how we're going to get a lot of this vehicle-to-grid technology going, and the energy management systems, and building grid interactive building systems actually up and functioning in the way that we envision them to be able to do. And I would just add that an extension of the existing energy management systems there's a lot of interest now from DOE to bring those large building scale systems down to the level of a smaller building, so solutions for small businesses, under-resourced communities, and schools. So these sort of plug-and-play technologies that can be used in different ways and that don't necessarily require a very expensive central energy management system.
Before I turn it over to the audience, I do have another question. So you all mentioned different technologies, or some of you all mentioned the same similar ones, but think about the technology that you mentioned. What is a driver that you need in order for that technology to be successful?
Definitely support from the government, DOE, any other organizations that are supporting CEC in California, and just sort of a recognition of what the major problems are, because I do feel that there's some funding agencies that are sort of stuck in old ways of doing things at the device level, particularly in the plug load space, whereas now we really need to research things in the building level and in the integration between the connectivities with these devices.
I agree with everything you said.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Regulation's a big thing in the recycling field. Right, we need these standards put in place to figure out what kind of regulations we need to put, but also incentivize programs. Right, we talked about consumer electronics. How do we actually motivate people to return their batteries so that we can recycle them? We need community support for building these recycling facilities. A lot of people have this "not in my backyard" mentality, especially when you look at scary battery fires that may occur. But the more facilities we can put in place, the less transportation costs. We can cut down on the transportation costs, which is the main prohibiting cost factor for recycling.
I have a different point of view. I'm with an organization that represents the consumer technology industry, and it's a point of pride and tradition at my organization not to solicit government funding, tax credits, subsidies, and so forth. We tend not to need that. That's not to say individual entities in my industry don't do that, but as an organization, we don't petition for that sort of help. What we're trying to do with consumer tech, obviously, is create and market innovative products that consumers want to buy, and a whole range of product categories. What we tend not to need much of is heavy-handed regulation or traditional regulation. We're an industry of innovators, from startups to major multinational companies. And they both need that freedom and space to innovate. And when we're confronted with a challenge, a public policy goal of saving energy, reducing emissions, we have a way to get there that may not be the same way as other sectors. In fact, we tend to thrive in more flexible policy environments rather than rigid regulatory environments. And I illustrated some of what we've been up to in my earlier presentation. So we don't ask for too much. We try to deliver a whole lot, and we relish the stories that we heard from Impulse. And that kind of startup and innovative approach is the lifeblood of our industry.
Thanks for the kind words. But I also think that touching on the comments on Matter and various other things here, it's like I think it's incredibly important that we figure out ways to interop all these distributed energy resources that are coming online, and like it's going to get really complicated. There's also an intersection not with government, not necessarily with government directly, and not necessarily with like say consumer electronics like working groups, but it's like the safety standards and the compliance organizations and various other things there that I think is super, super, super important. Like how do you let's imagine you have 3 different batteries in your home and you need them to all work together. There's a bunch of both interop, but then safety constraints that need to get worked out, and like coming together as an industry and defining a way that makes sense. And it's not just batteries, it's solar, it's like your meter, it's various other things at the same time. That's going to be huge.
Excellent question, or excellent answers. I want to pass it to, I have other questions, but I do want to pass it to the audience.
So I think this is probably for Sam on the Impulse, which slide's still up. So as far as the batteries, I think you mentioned that the appliances typically change every 10 years or so. So I'm wondering what kind of a life cycle are you considering for the batteries in your products, and how do you work on the degradation over time? And then nod to the recycling, how recyclable are the batteries you're using?
That's a great question. So so we're using lithium iron phosphate. A big difference between like your traditional lithium ion and lithium iron phosphate is it's about like a 3,000 cycle life for some of the chemistries, if not more. Some of them go up to like 5,000 plus to 80%. And so what this means is even if you cycled the battery every single day, you're getting close to that 10-year life expectancy, which is, for reference, people cook about a kilowatt hour a meal, and a typical induction stoves use like 300-400 watt hours a day, if I remember correctly. I need to look at the DOE website again. I've probably said 3 different numbers today to different folks. But the point basically is, even if you're using this thing every day to cook, you're not actually going to cycle it 2,500 times in 10 years. And then if you cycle it like you're using it for basically home energy arbitrage or something similar, demand response, you might be cycling it you might be cycling it to 80% in that 10-year life expectancy of the battery, or 10-year life expectancy of the appliance. So our expectation is actually that you install the thing and the battery and the appliance have about the same longevity based on our understanding. But then from a recycling standpoint, the battery is removable and separately recyclable. It uses, like, apart from like steel case and aluminum kind of inner housing, is pretty much the cells, if that makes any sense. And there's adhesive in there, but it's not anything that I think some of the solvents you've mentioned couldn't defeat.
Other questions? I have lots.
This is also a question for Sam. Just thinking about sort of these distributed batteries versus centralized batteries. And, it's kind of trying to reconcile, like, which is better, basically. It seems like central batteries, you could do the same sort of backup to a lot of different things and have a smaller battery, versus it seems like, it's easier to enter the market with a smaller, just like a one product. But I was wondering what your sort of vision for that is, if you're thinking like all the appliances, eventually you'd centralize that battery, and then I don't know if that would make the communications and controls easier maybe, or if you think it's better to have it more distributed.
So there's a couple things going on here, and I think this is a really interesting question, because it's kind of like there's 2 approaches to doing home energy storage, like, and most companies are in approach 1, which is you centralize the battery, and you put it right next to the panel, and that's where you can do your export enforcement. You can do all of the, like, everything is kind of just there. And then there's folks talking about combining the battery with the panel, and so doing a combined load center. I think that's a great idea as well. What ends up happening, though, is I think everyone's talking about this on the academic side. I don't know if we're 5 years away, 10 years away from like piloted DC distribution in homes. Startups have a shorter shelf life than that, so we're mostly focused on AC distribution as the assumption near term. And so there's putting the battery, basically you need to upsize the inverter and upsize your distribution, which is still expensive, and in places like apartments where maybe you want to retrofit something in situ and you can't upgrade like the rest of the building, you're going to run into huge problems there. And so what we realized was there's actually when you approach the architecture of distributing the batteries in each individual appliance, you're actually going to reduce the peak loads on the panel, like at total, because suddenly if every individual high peak draw appliance has a battery, you've converted a 60 amp or 40 amp load to like an 8 to 10 amp load at maximum. And so suddenly your ability to stack multiple electrified appliances where maybe you couldn't have converted from gas before becomes a lot more straightforward. But it also means that, like, for the remaining loads, it's a lot easier to put a centralized battery to cover those. Like, it needs a much smaller inverter. Like, the dependency chain on that is a lot easier. So I think there's actually a collaboration angle between some of the big appliances have batteries, but then additionally, you've got a centralized thing maybe in your panel to cover the rest. The big challenge with this is communications. So it's like making sure that everything plays nice with each other. Our plan is to vertically integrate that stack within our products. But obviously this is something where, because that'll let us do a good job, but it's also something where we're not going to be contentious or exclusionary there. I think there's a really big opportunity to like define a standard for appliances that have storage in them for communicating with the rest of the house, and for other assets that might have storage or maybe are programmable loads or anything like that can also work nicely together.
So I'm glad you mentioned industry standards. That's really important. It's been touched on a couple of times this afternoon. It's something that my organization spends a lot of time in. We create industry consensus standards. Some of those relate to energy, ways to measure energy, and communication protocols too. But that's a really important aspect to getting things done and making sure things work together. And Alan, you mentioned a consortium approach to communication between devices and equipment in the home. But it starts with collaboration, private sector, public sector, NGOs working together at the table to come up with these standards.
So, Sam, I'm actually surprised, or maybe I blinked for a moment, but it seems like one reason that your pathway is attractive is you can actually get in there incrementally. The only thing people have to do is buy a stove. They don't have to convert the house like I did and pay tens and tens of thousands of dollars to rewire take out all the knob and tubes and all that stuff. So it seems to me that would be the natural way for you to enter the system, and we'll worry about sorting out the ecosystem later. But fortunately, you already recognize that communication is going to be the key. And now, just going over to communication, I completely agree with Doug that we got the technical standards are crucial, and that's what's happening on the internet protocols, such as Matter and others. There are these technical standards. The problem has been in these technical standards, the things they want to communicate on those for the internet protocols have little to do with energy. They somehow never get around to it. They're too busy communicating the important things like, is the robot vacuum cleaner plugged in, or the brush is full, or something like that. But they don't get around to the energy part. And this is where either researchers or somebody else has to get involved in saying, damn it, you're not finished with this protocol. You can't get it out, this technical standard, until it includes energy, so that Sam can have his stove talking to the refrigerator, to talking to the such and such, and so on.
Our manufacturer complained to me because they're helping us with some of the software bring up on various pieces of the system, and they were like, we put a Matter radio in there because we're looking ahead to this future, and they were like, there's no energy standard for Matter. Like, what category are you? And I'm like, I guess we're a generic device. But this is a real problem, because the issue is there's all this talk on how your like inverter needs to talk to sensors in your panel, current sensors in your panel, and there's a bunch of standards defined on this. The transport protocol was kind of left a little bit vague in a lot of cases, and it's unclear if something like Matter, which is a consumer protocol, will get the UL stamp of approval for something like this. And so while there's this ambiguity, then we've got to make there's various fun decisions to be made in the interim, but this is a real issue and actually does impact product architecture.
All right, thanks guys. Okay, more questions. So we have a lot of students in the audience. Sorry, I had to pull up, I didn't like the just blank blue screen. It just doesn't look good.
It was a good advertisement for us though, initially.
Yeah, for a while Impulse was on there, so that's great, but now we've got pretty scenery. But then there was a time where there was a blue screen and it was not pretty. Anyway, side note. Okay, so we have a lot of students in the audience. Welcome, students. I would like the panelists to speak on what kind of things okay, so I want you to speak to the students. What information should a student know prior to going into their career? All the students here are interested in this topic, so if you do a generic answer or an answer that is related to the technology or your career path, I think that's going to answer the question. But please give a little bit of advice for the students moving into the real world.
I guess I can go first. So I got into the space by, I was on the solar car team in my university, which is like you build a solar powered electric vehicle. We actually race it across Australia. So we built a couple different vehicles. It was like every 2 years we would compete. Got to learn stuff ranging from how to put a battery pack together, how to write a battery management software, how to do all these other things. But like the bigger root thing is do hands-on real stuff and like get project experience as soon as possible, even if it means like you're hacking on stuff by yourself for like LED lights for Burning Man or whatever you want to do there. And like seriously, no joke, this is like how to get the real hands-on experience. The other thing we've realized is like recruiting power electronics has been really hard, and firmware engineering are really hard to come by and really, really, really valuable in this space. And so from a technical skills standpoint, both of those are like, P0 from a recruiting standpoint for companies like ours, and are like really, really, really worth looking into. And then I think the other stuff is like this industry is increasingly software defined, and like there's a ton of, in some sense, there's actually finance angles coming into this as we're starting to price energy, and various energy markets are starting to like liberalize in a certain sense. So I think there's actually like even an angle for folks that are kind of more interested in finance, like please don't get into crypto, please do this instead.
So, I mean, energy efficiency is a multifaceted world. I've been spending 15 years in one facet of that relates to products of our industry. It's been interesting, but I could underscore the same things that were just said about the importance as a student, undergraduate, graduate of getting into the private sector, looking for those internships and opportunities during the school year, in between the school years. To seek out those chances to explore what's happening in the field in the private sector side. I'm a product of the UC system, a different campus, but I know UCI has always had a reputation for close collaboration with the business community, and it lives on ever more to this day with all sorts of things going on in and around campus with private sector companies. So I think that's a relative strength. If you're here, take advantage of that as an undergraduate or a graduate. And we, our members would say the same things about you can't get enough engineers or technical minds on some of these problems, but we sure need them.
Yeah, I completely agree. Getting as much exposure as possible, especially early career, is really important. I mean, that defined my path completely. I went to a small liberal arts college on music scholarships, and I had no idea what I was going to do with my chemistry degree coming out of undergrad. Went to a contracting company, and they said, we have this lab in Lamont, Illinois that's looking for a research assistant. Wouldn't even tell me the name. I had just interviewed at BP Oil Company too, so I was offered a position at BP Oil Company and a research assistant position at Argonne National Lab doing electric vehicle work. So it was kind of a crazy situation. So I worked at Argonne for 2 years, and I had no idea I could pursue a PhD until I worked with PhDs and realized, I'm contributing valuable ideas already at this level. I can do this. I see myself now in this position. So I think exposure is really important. I had no idea about the electric vehicle field. I met my thesis advisor at Argonne when he was giving a talk, and went to University of Illinois Chicago. And then during my time, he motivated me a lot to pursue internships. So I went back to Argonne as an intern, working in cell development, the cell analysis modeling and prototyping facility, did a year doing that. So really interesting to see synthesis and then cell development. So very areas of the battery field. During the pandemic summer, I did an internship with SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, especially at the national lab space. You'll find a lot of mentors, unofficial mentors, that will be able to, give you some guidance in your path. I think reaching out continuously to professors, to people in the field, everyone's willing to talk about their path, and I think, and supporting young researchers or people in this academic setting. So just continually reach out and kind of talk about where you want to go, and people will find a way to get you there.
Yes, people like to talk about their own careers, and I am in that camp too. Let's talk on a much higher level. There's this whole energy problem, and maybe you're going to study energy, but very often when people think of energy, they are amazingly supply side oriented. They think about power plants, windmills, solar, whatever's left on that side, nuclear, and so on. And one of the things that I guess I realized because of where I was and who I was working with was that there's really there's an equality. For every unit of energy that's introduced into the economy, there's a unit of energy that is consumed or actually transformed into services. And more often than not, when people see an energy problem, they translate it into increased supply. Whereas I think you have to realize that there's an alternative, which is actually reduce consumption. Now, that sounds like sacrifice, but it can be treated much more innovatively. How do we increase efficiency? How do we extract more services from the same amount of that energy? But more often than not, I have seen people just go time and time directly to the supply side without really thinking about the fact that, well, you know, the largest use of electricity in the economy is electric motors. When did you see an electric motor on the cover of a magazine as part of the energy crisis or something? You've seen nuclear power plants, you know, time and time again. You've seen Fukushima. But when did you see an electric motor, which is responsible for 2/3 of the electricity we use? Maybe it's a little less now. I can't remember. But it's a lot. And so so maybe it's easier not to build a new nuclear power plant and much easier to make motors more efficient. And to see that trade-off and understand that there are lots of opportunities over on the other side of the meter. And that's what I want to say.
I agree with that, yeah. And just the general user behavior issues, don't overlook that as well. Okay, so what I would add to all the wonderful things that everyone has stated is maybe a little dry, but definitely be aware of policy and regulations, because once you go out into the real world, if you're an engineer, your whole life is OSHA. I have a brother who's a mechanical engineer, and that's a lot of what he does, is conforming to the standards. And so make sure you start looking at those, because that's going to be very important in your life. On the flip side, the other thing that's very important when you're going into energy efficiency, or really any of these large problem areas where you have complex problems to solve, is to engage your creativity. If you guys, I would encourage all of you to take up an instrument or paint and do something that is not engineering for part of their time, so that you can think in different ways, and that will help you solve problems in the real world.
Thank you. Questions?
This is kind of related to the second to last response about focusing on the demand side of energy. When I think of that, I think of electric vehicles, because we're switching to electrification for cars, and which is going to take a lot more raw material and energy, and it also makes the cars heavier, which increases road degradation by like multiple times. So I'm just wondering, from a sustainability perspective, would just electrifying cars make a significant difference without offering more alternatives, such as like e-bikes or e-scooters, or even like trains or buses and things like that?
If you're expecting a yes or no answer to that, here. I'll give you maybe Catherine, but somebody might. Does anybody else want to address that? Because you asked too big a question. That's if you start saying, well, let's talk about roads. Yeah, there's roads. If you talk about driver behavior and transportation habits, we had a talk about that. And there can be many alternatives spanning the technology. And so there is not a monolith that says this is an electric vehicle. In fact, there's a range of transportation alternatives that sometimes electric vehicles make simpler, and some of them they make worse. And I don't know what the right mix will be, but it's something that we need to understand. But that you will see, if you go to New Delhi now, they have a completely different way of electrifying their three-wheelers. Has anybody been in New Delhi here? Nobody? You see, you go there, get a three-wheeler, and they swap out the batteries every half day. They've got that organized. That's a completely different business model than we have in the United States, and it works. But if all I'm just trying to say is there are all sorts of different variations, and so the question you asked, I don't want to insult you, but it was too big and too monolithic. You've got to slice it down.
Right. Oh, sorry.
I got a yes/no answer to this question. So the yes/no answer to this one is actually, I think, pretty simple. It's like the straight up amount of material, also pre-battery recycling, by the way. Battery recycling is going to help this a lot. Is pre-battery recycling, it's like orders of magnitude more gasoline and fossil fuel, like basically oil, is extracted to drive a car like 100,000 miles over its like typical lifetime than in the embodied emissions of the EV. And then the amount of lithium in the EV is like it's like tens of kilograms or something like that. Like there's actually like not a ton. People all focus on lithium mining, but the actual total lithium per vehicle is not very large. But I still think like there's a lot of feedback on like what we should do to cities, how we should make things more walkable, how we should like focus on micromobility as an answer. Maybe we should be bundling e-bikes with every giant 200 kilowatt hour truck that we're going to start selling next year, or something silly like that. But it does appear that like people are starting to take this stuff seriously in a democratized sense. And I'm expecting, like I live in San Francisco, and honestly the biggest danger to someone of my age is like getting hit by a car when someone drives through a stop sign. And so I do think that like e-bikes are actually making cycling more accessible to a whole host of people, and it's going to increase demand for safe infrastructure and in some sense drive down average transportation consumption and emissions.
Great answers.
I mean, I'll add one thought that, I mean, if it's not obvious already from all the presentations today, but there are a lot of good ideas out there and a lot of good trends that we've heard about today, but there are also trade-offs, right? And you got a good sense of that too. And so if you're looking at this academically, I think it's helpful, interesting, and certainly contributory to look at those trade-offs and to help, you know, the public and the private sector understand and quantify those trade-offs. Because we have these ambitious goals and they sound good and they're all green, but each one of these decisions, there's a cost, there's a real world cost, and that has to be understood. So unlike I think my fellow panelists here, I spend most of my time on that dry topic of public policy. I'm an industry advocate. And so I'm out there a lot talking to policymakers, to domestic and international, about these issues, at least as they relate to our industry. But it's very important for them to be fully informed about the policy decisions that they make, right? And so we're there to at least give another side of it, make a contribution, whether it's power consumption information or cost or both. But I think that's really important to keep in mind as we're looking at all these options too. Question there.
So I kind of like what Alan said earlier about how the industry met and exceeded your expectations about standby power. And I was wondering what the rest of or if there were any other situations where you've been kind of pleasantly surprised by the industry and what they were able to come up with. An example I had was my phone does adaptive charging now, and it all of a sudden did this. I didn't ask for it. And now when I set my alarm for 6:30, it kind of makes it so that it doesn't draw an immense amount of power immediately, and it stretches it out over time. So that's kind of my example, and I was wondering if the panelists could share any examples like that.
Well, I'll start. My off-the-cuff comment on that is that technology is an energy-saving solution in many cases, and we do need that freedom to innovate toward a goal and come up with these neat things that weren't required by regulation or mandate, but came up as something that is consumer-friendly and energy-saving. Alan, I'm sure you have a couple of thoughts.
Maybe other people have things to say about that. All right, so quite a while ago, I proposed this idea of 1 watt, and I nearly got fired as this 1 watt reducing standby on all appliances. And the thing that happened was actually not in the United States, but some Australians the Australian government got a hold of it. And so the Australians got curious about it. They said, hey, that's a pretty neat idea. And, well, a couple things happened. And by total coincidence, President Bush was down here and saw a display I did on standby power. You should always make displays, especially ones that they can push buttons, and especially when presidents like to push buttons. Those are the things that cause, well, he wrote a presidential order which caused Doug enormous amounts of That's why industry moved quickly. But also, that I was in Europe, and I made friends with a member of the European Parliament, and they decided they had to do something about standby. They were even more religious about it than we were, and which was not very much, I might add. And they said they had to do something, and basically the member of Parliament said, all right, we need to have a new law about this, and he created the law, and that actually was the first law that created the whole framework for energy efficiency regulations in Europe. And I would have never expected that, but that's how it happened. And so I think, but nevertheless, I wasn't sure that the manufacturers could do it. And that's why I continue to say it's really amazing that manufacturers were able to totally overhaul the design of their products, and in a very short time make them with a very low standby. And in fact, it got to the point, or it has already gotten to the point, where they started asking me, as if I was some sort of Solomonic figure, how do you measure zero standby? We think we have a product that is zero standby. How do we define it? Because it was so low, it was below the measurement error. And so we had to actually revise all the test procedures to include the fact that now the standby had gotten so close to zero, it was measurably zero, according to the test procedure. And so, you see, I guess I agree with Doug a lot, but there's a push-me-pull-you kind of thing going on here. And if there isn't this creative tension of a lot of different kinds of groups, and Californias and Australias and all sorts of other things going on, that's the kind of progress and the environment that I think creates the greatest headaches for Doug, but actually the greatest opportunities too.
I have a comment on exactly this.
I'll go next then.
So my comment on exactly this is we've actually debated the standby power of our products, and it's actually very fun to I would actually say that having constraints makes running an engineering organization much better, because you can just be like, hey, yeah, that's the standard and we got to do it. And now like you will just contort yourself into being below a watt or whatever you need to be to make stuff work. And it's actually been interesting because we have to think creatively on this, because we have in some sense a potentially always on battery and inverter, but we're also an appliance. So from a standby power perspective, there's kind of a couple different things going on, and making sure that we kind of check a bunch of different boxes at the same time is an interesting challenge, to be clear. But I also like, it's also fascinating with like standby power is the amount of energy that is wasted from high standby power on things is actually quite preposterous once you think about it. And it's pretty cool that we've been able to wrangle a lot of this under control.
So Alan's idea was beautiful and frustrating at the same time, but it was significant. It does show you the power of having a goal, 1 watt, right? Now, the frustrating part was that it got taken by policymakers and made into a one-size-fits-all mandate, and there was the problem, because not all products and equipment can fit under that 1 watt limit. But it was a beautiful idea, and to the extent that it was manifested in Energy Star specifications, which are voluntary and flexible, hey, great, and it was. But as soon as the regulators got a hold of it, that was a different story. But I wouldn't change a thing, because it did give impetus and motivation to transform a market at the time. Now we're dealing with standby power of a different nature, and I mentioned this briefly earlier. Products are more complex. They have different modes of active standby to enable all these cool, smart features we like in our products. So we have to appreciate that standby power is higher now, and think of creative ways to get that down lower. And I spent some time talking about the TV voluntary agreement as an example of that. But no, kudos to you. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and we certainly lived that.
Talk about something else, yeah.
Well, as an example of what Alan was talking about, the push me, pull me phenomenon, we were just in a project with LEDWP last year doing gain console, low power mode research with a survey. And one of the things that is definitely being talked about within the major manufacturers of game consoles here now is the idea of shipping the product with the low standby power modes already enabled so that it doesn't use huge amount of energy when the person who's using the game is not actually there interacting with it. And this is a standard that's been around in Europe for like a decade. So they're realizing that that's saving a lot of energy in Europe, and now they're thinking, well, maybe we need to expand this to other markets. So, yeah.
Hey, I have one more question to wrap it up, unless there is another question from the audience. I want to thank the panelists so much, and the other panelists that are in the audience for speaking today. This has been a really valuable conversation. I'm taking notes as we speak. So my last question is, earlier during one of the presentations, Alan's, he talked about how he missed something. He missed the fact that EVs would become big. Was that one of your reasons? Yeah, and a couple other things as well. So for the panelists, I'm going to ask a similar question. We're here right now in 2023. What is that big thing that you think we are going to miss? I want to know what that is. That's a hard question because it makes you think about you don't know what you don't know, that type of thing. But I'm interested in what we come up with from that question. So I think we'll go down the line. Yep.
I know there's one issue that is definitely coming into view for energy efficiency that is maybe right now not measurable is the impact of all of these IoT devices and the overall the energy that is used at the collective level when we're all on our phones or increasingly on every kind of device in our house that is connected to the internet all the time. This is something where we'll need to develop new metrics because we don't really have good test methods for understanding how these devices are being, what the data server usage is versus what it is in your own home, and sort of like what the effect is between all these different systems. So that's something that is evolving and that I think is going to continue to be a bigger part of the energy pie as we go on.
So I think it was 2 years ago, Governor Newsom sent all of us a text message saying, our grid is about to melt down, unplug everything you can and help us. And within minutes, electricity demand fell, depends who you talk to, but at least 2 gigawatts. That's 2 Diablo Canyons or something like that. A lot of electricity. And the grid did not melt down. And that just, I think, reflects how important behavior can be at different, that's an extreme situation, except that you'll see that the same thing happened in Tokyo 6 months before when the grid was about to melt down, and they put out a plea, and they were literally within 15 minutes of shutdown, and they managed to get people to do precisely the same thing. There are examples of that in Sweden and a few other places. The grid authorities deny that that capability exists, but when it comes down, when push comes to shove, and they don't have any other opportunities or options, they tell us to unplug. So, but I think behavior in general is hugely underappreciated as an opportunity to shift energy demand, energy consumption, and also affect our quality of life. And so I don't know how to say anything more except that's the most unappreciated next big thing?
Since recycling is so new domestically, but other countries already have these established processes, pyro processing. So it can be cheaper to send our end-of-life batteries to these countries to be refined and then sold back to us. So we need motivation and we need incentivized programs, right? We have these tax benefits for buying electric vehicles that are fully manufactured in the US, but now it needs to go back to the supply chain. And if we can find these sources, these domestic sources of the materials, then they need to also have the tax benefit to be able to have these manufacturers looking for those domestic sources as well as recyclability. So it's a really interesting field to watch, but it's also a race because we're at risk of being in the same loop that we are currently in for getting materials from other countries.
So we're an industry of innovators, as I mentioned, and there will be something new. There always is. And I'm not going to tell you specifically what that is because I don't know. But I can tell you that in these voluntary agreements that we developed, we have an element called the new features process, which gives some flexibility to the signatory companies to deploy an innovation, self-declare an allowance for that, and then come back to the steering committee to set an allowance that would apply across the industry. Very simplified version, that's what it is. But that gives flexibility to innovate under a program, an organized approach that's designed to save energy. So I can guarantee you that there will be something new around the corner, unforeseen. We don't know what that is, but what we can do is come up with creative policy approaches that can address and handle that along the way.
I think I heard I heard you say that you were surprised by the rollout of EVs, but I think the next shoe to drop is people are going to be surprised at the capacity crunch that's about to hit, like basically your local block when your transformer is oversubscribed, when everyone on your block gets an EV charger or two. So that's like an extra 60 to 100 watt or 100 kilowatts. They electrify all their appliances. So that's another 40 plus, or 60 to 100 amps, sorry. That's another 40 plus amps per appliance. And so now we're running into the situation where homes could be consuming 2 times as much peak power as they used to before. And we look at the IRA, we look at where the incentives are. We're all talking about transmission, but we're not talking necessarily about transmission on your block and your utilities having the budget to upgrade everyone. And individual consumers and homeowners not being able necessarily to be able to afford like a $20,000 their share of the transformer upgrade on their block when all this stuff starts to happen. So I think that's going to be the surprise that's going to come the back half of this decade. And it's going to be not necessarily the most enjoyable experience unless we've got mitigations in place. It could be like 2 years, yeah.
Sooner.
All right, well, I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank all the speakers. I also want to thank Patricia. I want to thank the Calplug team and the University of California, Irvine for hosting this excellent workshop. Please join us outside in the lobby area for a reception. Patricia, pardon? Oh, and dinner. And thank you all for being here, and let's keep in touch, exchange emails, keep in touch, and we'll see you in a half a year for the next one.